The shot broke clean at dawn, and time stopped the way it always does when a bullet is in flight. 4 seconds. That's how long physics demanded for 1,200 meters of air and wind and gravity to transform intention into consequence. 4 seconds while Staff Sergeant Elena Garrison held her breath and watched through the scope as the world continued without knowing death was already traveling toward it. The Taliban spotter dropped before the sound arrived. Clean. Center mass. One moment scanning the valley with binoculars, the next moment gone, crumpled against the rocks like discarded laundry. The radio crackled. Good hit, who's the shooter? Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, prone beside her with the spotting scope, keyed his mic without hesitation. Garrison. There was a pause, not long, maybe 3 heartbeats. Then Captain Bradley Harmon's voice cut through the static with the kind of certainty that comes from never having been tested. Negative. Log it as team effort, Chen primary. Garrison's been here 3 weeks. No way she makes that shot. Chen's jaw tightened. Elle could see it in her peripheral vision, the muscle jumping beneath sun-darkened skin. Sir, I was on spotting scope. It was Garrison. Sergeant, I gave you an order. Elle's finger was still on the trigger guard. She hadn't moved since the recoil. The rifle stock was warm against her cheek, familiar as breathing. She keyed her own mic, voice level, empty of everything that mattered. Sir, Chen is correct, but if you need to adjust the report for command review, I understand. Chen turned his head just enough to look at her. The question in his eyes was the same one she'd been answering since basic training, since sniper school, since the first time someone looked at her and saw limitation instead of capability. Why don't you fight? She shook her head, just once, small enough that only he would see. The movement was an echo, a ghost, because 68 years earlier, on frozen ground half a world away, another woman had made the exact same gesture for the exact same reason. Korea, 1951. Winter came to the Chosin Reservoir like judgment, temperatures dropping to 25 below zero, wind turning the mountainous terrain into a frozen hell that killed as efficiently as bullets. Sergeant Ruth Garrison was 23 years old and had been in country for 4 months, which made her ancient by the standards of men who measured their lives in the distance between frostbite and home. She was prone in snow that had turned to ice, M1C rifle cradled in arms wrapped in every layer she owned. Beside her, Corporal Vincent Cross pressed his eye to the spotting scope, 21 years old and still surprised every morning that the cold hadn't killed him in his sleep. The firefight below them was dying. Not in the clean way of movies, but in the messy, desperate way of real combat where men screamed, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood freezing on snow. The reconnaissance team, Marines who'd pushed too far north and gotten cut off, had walked into an ambush so perfectly laid that Ruth knew immediately someone had underestimated enemy intelligence. Someone always did. 6 tangos, Cross whispered through chattering teeth. Left flank, moving to cut off the exfil. Ruth tracked her scope across the tree line. Found them. Chinese regulars, disciplined, moving with coordinated precision through terrain that should have been impassable. They were positioning to envelope the Americans in a classic L-shaped ambush. 3 minutes, maybe 4, and the Marines would be surrounded completely. Range, she breathed. 840 meters. Wind northeast at 12, gusting to 15. She made the adjustments without conscious thought. Elevation. Windage. The math was instinct now, woven into muscle memory through 10,000 practice rounds and 57 days of real combat in conditions that made shooting an act of defiance against nature itself. Her finger found the trigger. 6 shots, 48 seconds. The Chinese soldiers dropped one by one, and the snow swallowed the sound of their falling the same way it swallowed everything else. Cross was on the radio immediately, voice crackling with cold and something like awe. "Recon 6, this is Overwatch. Area secure. Who the hell is our sniper? She just saved our asses." The response came back flat and immediate and utterly predictable. "Overwatch, negative on she. No female personnel authorized this sector. You will report shooter as Corporal Cross. Acknowledge." Cross looked at Ruth. She was already working the bolt, chambering another round, ready for targets that might not come. She didn't meet his eyes. "Sarge," he started. "Take the credit, Vincent." Her voice was steady despite the cold that made speech painful, empty. The same voice Elle would use 68 years later, speaking the same surrender. "I need to stay in the field, not get reassigned to typing pool in Busan." "That's not right." "Right doesn't matter if I'm benched." She finally looked at him then, and Cross saw something in her eyes that would haunt him for the next 7 decades. Not anger. Anger would have been clean, would have been something he could understand. This was deeper, wearier. The look of someone who'd already fought this battle 100 times in 4 months and learned that winning and losing were sometimes the same thing. "We have a job. Let me do it." Cross acknowledged the order, logged himself as primary shooter, watched Ruth pack her rifle with movements so practiced they looked like prayer despite fingers stiff with cold, and made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He stayed silent. The first betrayal is always the hardest, the rest just echo. Afghanistan, 2019. The tent at Camp Vanguard smelled like dust and diesel fuel, and the particular staleness of air that had cycled through too many lungs in too small a space. Elle sat on her cot, the leather journal open in her lap, reading words written in handwriting so similar to her own it felt like looking in a mirror across time. Shot number 22. Distance 1,800 m, wind variable, temperature -15 Fahrenheit. Impossible geometry in frozen conditions. But they needed me, so I made the distance disappear. That's what snipers do. We collapse space between threat and safety, even if nobody sees it happen. There were 40 entries in the journal, 40 confirmed kills that had never made it into any official record. Ruth Garrison had died in 2008, 11 years ago, and Elle had been 17, old enough to understand death but too young to understand erasure. The funeral had been small, military honors performed by a color guard that didn't know who they were honoring. A folded flag presented to Elle's father, Samuel Garrison Jr., who'd accepted it with the same weary grace his mother had shown accepting invisibility. The footlocker had come to Elle after her father's death 3 years later. Cancer, the kind that seemed to hunt down Korean War veterans with particular cruelty, delayed by decades but no less lethal. Inside she'd found the journal, the rifle, the Purple Heart that represented the only wound anyone had been willing to acknowledge, and a letter. The letter was why she'd enlisted, why she'd pushed through sniper school when the instructors looked at her like a diversity checkbox they were obligated to pass, why she was here now, in this tent in this war, making shots that would be credited to someone else. The letter was short. Ruth had never been one for wasted words. "Whoever finds this, I was erased from the record because I didn't fit their story. But every shot I took mattered. Every soldier who came home because I was watching, they mattered. If you're reading this, you're probably trying to decide whether to fight a system that doesn't see you. Here's my answer: don't fight. Just shoot straight. The truth is in the distance." Elle traced the words with her finger, the ink faded but the meaning sharp as the day it was written. Don't fight. Just shoot straight. She'd followed that advice for 4 months now. 14 confirmed kills logged as team efforts or credited to her spotters, or simply disappeared into the administrative void where inconvenient truths went to die. She'd watched Chen argue, watched him submit documentation, watched it all get kicked back with bureaucratic efficiency. She hadn't complained, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't done anything except exactly what Ruth had told her to do: shoot straight, let the target be the only judge. But the targets were piling up, and so was something else. A weight, a debt, the feeling that silence wasn't wisdom, it was just another kind of erasure. The tent flap opened. Chen ducked inside, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who just lost an argument with authority and knew he was about to lose another one with his conscience. "Harmon logged it as my kill," he said without preamble. "Added a note that you provided valuable support as spotter, which is bullshit and we both know it." Elle closed the journal carefully. "It's fine, Marcus." "It's not fine. You made a 1,200-meter shot in variable wind on your first week in this sector. That's not valuable support. That's skill 90% of snipers in this whole theater couldn't match." And saying that out loud changes what exactly? Chen sat down on the cot across from her, close enough in the cramped space that their knees almost touched. He was a good spotter, patient and precise, and she'd learned in their short time together that he had the particular brand of loyalty that made good soldiers and troubled consciences. "My grandfather served in Korea," he said, voice dropping to something more private. "Republic of Korea Army liaison attached to a U.S. Marine unit. Winter of 1951. They got ambushed near the Chosin Reservoir. Would have been overrun, all of them dead, except a sniper pulled their asses out of the fire. 6 Chinese soldiers, 48 seconds in -20-degree cold. My grandfather said it was like watching an angel of death work." Elle's hand stilled on the journal. "Marcus." "The sniper was a woman. They never told him her name, never acknowledged she existed in official records, but my grandfather knew, the whole team knew. They tried to submit her for recognition. The paperwork disappeared. She was erased." He looked at the journal in her lap, at the rifle case propped against the tent wall. "Your grandmother was Ruth Garrison." It wasn't a question. Elle met his eyes and saw something there that made her chest tighten. Recognition. Not of her, but of the pattern, the repetition. History doing what it always did, rhyming instead of repeating, but hitting the same beats with the same inevitable rhythm. "Ruth saved my grandfather's life," Chen continued. "He came home, had a family, lived to see his grandchildren because of her, and the army erased her like she never existed." His jaw clenched. "They're doing it to you, the same thing, and I'm helping them by staying quiet." "You're following orders." "So are the people who erased Ruth." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Elle thought about her grandmother, 23 years old in frozen mountains, already learning that excellence could be a liability when it came wrapped in the wrong package. Thought about the choice Ruth had made, to accept invisibility for the privilege of continued service. "Don't fight, just shoot straight." But Ruth had also written those 40 entries in the journal, had documented every shot, every distance, every life saved, had kept her own record of a truth the army wouldn't acknowledge. That wasn't surrender. That was resistance of a different kind. Quieter, more patient. Maybe more dangerous. "My grandmother made her choice," Elle said finally. "I'm making mine. To be erased. To do the job." She opened the journal again, turned to a page near the middle. "Shot number 33, 3 targets, 12 seconds in sub-zero wind. Vincent said it was impossible, but impossible just means nobody's done it yet. We did it. They lived. That's all that matters." Chen read the entry, his expression shifting through confusion to comprehension to something that looked like pain. She didn't care about the credit. She cared about the work. "The credit is politics, the work is real." Elle closed the journal. "I can't control what Harmon writes in his reports. I can control where I put the bullet, that's enough." It should have been enough. Ruth had made it enough for an entire career, for 40 kills and dozens of lives saved, and a legacy that existed only in the memories of men who'd gone home to their families, because a woman they'd never met had collapsed the distance between them and death. But Chen was right about one thing. The pattern was repeating, and somewhere in the machinery of that repetition, something was breaking. Elle could feel it the way snipers learn to feel shifts in wind pressure, the subtle change that meant the shot you planned wouldn't be the shot you'd get. The breaking point came 3 days later, delivered in the form of a man Elle had never met, but whose presence filled the tent like memory made physical. Colonel James Brennan was 86 years old, retired for 2 decades but recalled as special advisor on historical military operations. He'd served in Korea as a young enlisted man, witnessed things that shaped his understanding of war and institutions, and the price of acknowledging uncomfortable truths. He stood in the operations center at Camp Vanguard, reviewing personnel files with the methodical attention of a man who'd learned early that the devil lived in administrative details. When he reached Elle's file, his expression changed. Just for a moment, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or might have been something darker. "Garrison," he said to Major Sarah Vick, the operations officer standing beside him. "Any relation to Ruth Garrison, Korea 1951? Vick glanced at the file. "Granddaughter, sir, why?" Brennan closed the folder with the careful precision of a man closing a door. "Reassign her. Force protection. Effective immediately." "Sir?" Vick's voice carried the particular tone of an officer who just heard an order that made no tactical sense. "Sergeant Garrison has 14 confirmed kills in 4 months. She's one of our most effective snipers." "She's reassigned, Major. That's not a discussion." Vick was smart enough to know when to push and when to document. She pushed. "Sir, with respect, can you provide tactical justification? We're short on sniper assets as it is." Brennan looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten too little. Her grandmother was a complication that nearly cost us operational security in Korea, made questionable judgment calls. "I was there. I know the truth." He tapped the folder. "Bad judgment runs in families. I'm not making the same mistake twice." The words were precise, surgical, designed to cut without leaving evidence of the blade. Vick opened her mouth to protest, saw the futility in Brennan's expression and made her own choice. She saluted, acknowledged the order, and the moment Brennan left, she picked up the phone and called a number she'd sworn she'd never use except in emergency. The phone rang 4 times before a voice answered, rough with age and mourning, and the accumulated weight of too many memories. "Gross." "Vinny, it's Sarah Vick. We served together in Iraq 2004, you remember." There was a pause, the sound of recognition clicking into place. "Major Vick, you pulled me out of that firefight in Fallujah, saved my life. What's wrong?" "He's doing it again. Brennan, Elle Garrison, Ruth's granddaughter, he's burying her." The silence that followed was different, heavier. Vick could almost hear something breaking in it, some decision that had been deferred for 68 years, finally reaching the point where deferral became complicity. "I'm too old for this," Cross said, but his voice carried no conviction. "You owe Ruth." "I know what I owe." Another pause, then, "I'll be on the next flight to Bagram." The call ended. Vick sat in her office, looking at Elle's file, at the numbers that told a story the official reports refused to acknowledge. 14 confirmed kills. Average range 1,340 meters. Success rate 97%. Statistics that would make any sniper in the theater jealous, buried under bureaucratic language and institutional blindness. She thought about Ruth Garrison, erased from history for the crime of excellence in the wrong body. Thought about the pattern repeating, the system grinding forward with the same inevitable momentum that had crushed a generation of women who dared to believe service mattered more than optics. Then she made another call, this one to a number that didn't officially exist, to a man who'd made a career of operating in the spaces where official and necessary diverged. "This is Vic. I need to talk to Colonel McAllister. Yes, I know he's retired. Tell him it's about Ruth Garrison. Tell him it's time to pay the debt." Elle learned about the reassignment from Chen, who'd heard it from the operations clerk, who'd seen the paperwork before it was even filed. The unofficial network that existed in every military unit, the grapevine that moved faster than orders and sometimes more accurately. "Force protection." Chen's voice was tight with anger. "You're the best shot in this camp and they're putting you on perimeter guard duty." Elle was cleaning her rifle, the ritual of disassembly and inspection that every sniper knew by heart. Bolt, chamber, barrel, each piece examined, cleaned, reassembled. The meditation of maintenance. New advisor wants new assignments. It happens. "This isn't random." Elle Brennan asked about your grandmother specifically. About Ruth. Her hand stilled on the cleaning rod. "What did he say?" "That she was a complication who made questionable calls. That bad judgment runs in families." Chen's voice carried the particular fury of a man who'd heard his own grandfather's life dismissed as collateral damage. "It's bullshit. Ruth saved lives, my grandfather's life, and now he's using her to bury you." Elle set down the rifle, walked to her footlocker, pulled out the journal and the letter and the photograph she'd found tucked in the back pages. Ruth Garrison, 23 years old, in cold weather gear, holding an M1C rifle with the casual competence of someone who'd learned to trust the weapon more than the institution that issued it. She looked young in the photo, not in years but in something else, some quality that hadn't yet been worn away by accumulated erasure. Elle wondered when that had changed. Which shot? Which denial? Which moment of swallowed protest had been the one that transformed expectation into acceptance? "Chen, did your grandfather ever talk about Ruth after the war?" Every year on the anniversary of the ambush, he'd pour soju just a little and tell the story about the ghost sniper who saved his life. He tried to find her, spent years searching through records, but there was nothing. It was like she'd never existed. Chen's voice softened. "He died 3 years ago, heart disease. Last thing he said to me was find her, tell her thank you. I couldn't, she was already gone." Elle traced her grandmother's face in the photograph. Tried to imagine the woman behind the expression, behind the 40 entries in the journal, behind the choice to accept invisibility for the sake of continued service. Tried to understand if that choice had been wisdom or just weariness dressed up in noble language. The tent flap opened without warning. A man stepped inside, old enough that his presence anywhere should have been remarkable, but carrying himself with the kind of easy authority that made age irrelevant. He was 89, white hair cut military short and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything except perhaps his own capacity for regret. He looked at Elle, then at the photograph in her hand. His expression cracked, just for a moment, like ice over deep water. "You have her eyes," he said. His voice carried the weight of decades. "I'd know them anywhere." Elle stood slowly, instinct putting her between the stranger and Chen, tactical awareness overriding curiosity. "Who are you?" "Master Sergeant Vincent Cross, retired, formerly Corporal Cross, Recon Company, 1st Marine Division, Korea." He looked at the photograph again. "Spotter for the finest sniper I ever had the privilege to serve beside, your grandmother." The air in the tent changed, became heavier, charged with the particular electricity that comes when the past stops being abstract history and becomes immediate, physical, real. Chen found his voice first. "You were Ruth Spotter, you were there, the ambush. You saw her make those shots. I saw her make a lot of shots, 612 to be precise, 40 of them confirmed kills. The rest cover fire, suppression, threat elimination in the worst conditions imaginable. Cross's eyes never left Elle's face. I logged every single one. Documented distances, wind speeds, temperatures below zero, and I watched the army erase them like they never happened. Why? The word came out harder than Elle intended. Why did you let them? Cross flinched. It was a small movement but unmistakable, the physical manifestation of a wound that had never healed. Because I was 21 and scared, and they told me I'd lose everything if I fought, so I took the credit. I let them write me up for her kills. I stood silent while they discharged her for being better than every man in the unit. He took a breath. And I've regretted it every day for 68 years. The confession hung in the air. Elle thought about her grandmother's letter. Don't fight. Just shoot straight. Wondered if Ruth had written that to her future granddaughter or to her past spotter, a message across time to the man who'd chosen silence over solidarity. She made you promise, Elle said, understanding clicking into place. She told you to let it go. Cross nodded. After the war, 1954, she was back stateside, discharged quietly. They said she was unsuitable for continued service, even though she'd performed flawlessly in the worst winter combat conditions of the war. I went to see her to apologize, to tell her I'd make it right, and she said, his voice cracked. She said, Vincent, I'm getting married. I'm going to have children. I'm going to bury this war and move on. And I need you to help me by letting it stay buried. So you did. I did because she asked, because I owed her that much at least, because I thought maybe she was right, that silence was a kind of peace. Cross looked at the journal in Elle's hands. But then she died, and I realized silence wasn't peace. It was just permission for the pattern to repeat. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a worn envelope, handed it to Elle. Inside were documents, old enough that the paper had yellowed but preserved with the care of someone who knew they were keeping evidence of a crime. After-action reports in Cross's handwriting, kill confirmations, witness statements from soldiers whose lives Ruth had saved, photographs of her in the field behind the rifle, doing the work the army would later pretend she'd never done. And at the bottom, a single piece of paper that made Elle's breath catch. Distinguished Service Cross Recommendation, submitted by Major Marcus McAllister, Recon Battalion Commander, for Sergeant Ruth Garrison, for actions on December 9, 1951, for shots that saved 8 men from certain death in sub-zero conditions at the Chosin Reservoir. Stamped across it in red ink, classified, Recommendation DENIED. McAllister tried, Cross said quietly. He was a good man, a true believer in merit over politics. He submitted that paperwork 3 times. It disappeared 3 times. Finally, they told him if he pushed any more, they'd classify the entire operation and everyone involved would be buried under security restrictions that would last decades. Cross's jaw tightened. One of the people who delivered that message was a young private at the time, 18 years old, ambitious, smart. Good at understanding which way institutional winds blew. Brennan, Elle said. James Brennan, he was there. He saw what Ruth could do, and it terrified him, not the enemy, her. A woman who could outshoot every man in the unit in conditions that should have made accurate shooting impossible. Cross looked at Elle with eyes that carried nearly 7 decades of weight. He spent his entire career making sure women like Ruth stay invisible, and now he's here, your advisor, and he knows exactly who you are. The pieces fell into place. The reassignment, the comment about bad judgment running in families. Brennan wasn't trying to manage a personnel issue. He was finishing something he'd helped start in 1952, erasing the Garrison name from military history 1 generation at a time. Chen broke the silence. So what do we do? Cross smiled, and there was something dangerous in it, something that had been waiting 68 years for permission to act. We do what Ruth never got to do. We fight, but smart, patient, precise. The way she taught me to shoot. He looked at Elle. Your grandmother told me to stay silent. I kept that promise while she was alive, but she's gone now. And you're not asking me to stay quiet, are you? Elle thought about the journal, about 40 shots that mattered even though no one acknowledged them, about the letter that said don't fight, just shoot straight, about the woman in the photograph who'd chosen to be erased rather than benched. But she also thought about Chen's grandfather, going to his grave still looking for the woman who'd saved his life, about the Distinguished Service Cross recommendation stamped DENIED, about the pattern repeating, generation after generation, grinding down excellence into silence. Ruth had made her choice, but Elle wasn't Ruth. She was the granddaughter, carrying the same eyes and the same skill and the same choice. Except this time, the choice came with something Ruth hadn't had. A witness who refused to stay silent anymore. No, Elle said, I'm not asking you to stay quiet. Cross nodded, pulled out his phone, dialed a number from memory. When the voice answered, rough and old and carrying the particular weariness of men who'd served too long and seen too much, Cross's expression softened into something that might have been relief. Marcus, it's Vincent Cross. We served together in Korea. Recon Battalion, winter of 1951. You remember the ghost sniper, the one who saved your life at Chosin. I need to tell you about her, and I need your help making sure what happened to her doesn't happen again. The conversation lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, Cross looked at Elle and Chen with the expression of a man who just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. Colonel McAllister is on the Senate Armed Services Committee now, retired but still connected, still angry about what happened to Ruth. Cross put the phone away. He's making calls, and in 48 hours there's going to be a mission request, high-value target, extreme range. The kind of shot that only a handful of people in this theater could make. And Brennan will assign it to someone else, Chen said. He will, and when that someone fails or refuses or admits they're not qualified, Cross looked at Elle. That's when you step in, not asking permission, just doing the job, the way Ruth did, except this time there's going to be documentation, video, witnesses who won't be silenced, and a senator who's been waiting 68 years to make this right. Elle felt something shift in her chest. Not anger, not even determination, something quieter and more dangerous. The feeling of a trigger breaking, of a shot committed, of a bullet already in flight even though the target didn't know it yet. What's the target? Khalid Ahmadi, Taliban commander, financier for the IED network that's killed 14 coalition soldiers in the last 6 weeks. Cross's voice went flat. He's been moving between safe houses, impossible to pin down, but intel says they've got a lock on his location. 72 hours he's moving again. This is the window. Range. 2,100 meters, maybe more, variable wind, civilian proximity, the kind of shot that gets written up in textbooks or after-action reports explaining how it went wrong. Cross met her eyes. The kind of shot Ruth made in conditions nobody talks about because they sound impossible. The kind of shot you've been making for 4 months while Harmon took credit. Elle thought about her grandmother, accepting erasure for the privilege of taking one more shot. Thought about the choice between fighting and shooting straight. Wondered if maybe Ruth had been wrong, or if the world had just changed enough that silence was no longer strategy but surrender. The tent flap opened again. Major Vic stepped inside, took in the scene with the quick assessment of someone who'd learned to read situations at a glance and made a decision. Sergeant Garrison, you're not reassigned yet. The paperwork takes 72 hours to process, and in 72 hours we're going to have a mission request from JSOC that specifically asks for our best extreme range shooter. She looked at Brennan's orders on her tablet, then at Elle. I'm slow at paperwork. Always have been. Might take me 96 hours to process this reassignment. Maybe longer if the mission is active. Cross smiled. Major, you're going to make enemies. I'm already making enemies by having ovaries in a combat zone, Master Sergeant. Might as well make them count for something. Vic pulled up a chair, sat down like she was settling in for a briefing. So here's how this is going to work. The mission comes in. Brennan assigns it to someone unqualified. That person fails or refuses, or we document why they can't make the shot. Then Garrison steps in, makes the shot on camera with witnesses, and we dare Brennan to bury it. He will, Chen said. You know he will. He'll try, but this time he's not burying one woman sniper who nobody cares about. He's burying a mission success in front of a senator, a JSOC commander, and every operator who sees the footage. Vic's smile was sharp. Let him try. Let him explain to his superiors why he refused to use his best asset for a high-value target because of a 68-year grudge against a dead woman. The plan was forming, taking shape. Elle could feel it the way she felt a shot coming together, all the variables aligning, wind and distance and trajectory converging into a single inevitable moment. But there was something else, a weight, because this wasn't just about one shot anymore. It was about Ruth, about 40 kills that had been erased, about a Distinguished Service Cross recommendation stamped DENIAD, about 68 years of silence and the debt that silence had accumulated. Cross, Elle said quietly. If we do this, if we fight this fight, we're not just fighting for me. We're fighting for her, for Ruth, for the record. Cross nodded. His eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been rage or might have been both. I failed her once. I stayed silent when silence was easy and speech was hard. I told myself I was honoring her wishes, but I was just protecting myself. He reached out, placed his hand on the journal. I can't give her back the 40 shots they erased. I can't undo 68 years of erasure, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. I can make sure her granddaughter doesn't spend the next 68 years wondering if staying silent was wisdom or just cowardice with a prettier name. The words settled into the space between them, final, irrevocable, the kind of commitment that couldn't be taken back once spoken. Elle picked up the journal, opened it to the last entry. Read Ruth's words again, but this time hearing them differently. Not as instruction, but as epitaph. Not as wisdom, but as warning. Shot number 40. The last one I'll ever take in this war. Nobody will remember my name, but they'll go home. They'll have children. Those children will grow up free. That's what matters. Not yards, but generations. She looked up at Cross, at Vic, at Chen, at the people who decided that this time the pattern would break, that this time silence would not be strategy. All right, she said, let's make sure they remember. Outside, the sun was setting over Camp Vanguard, painting the dusk gold and red and the particular orange that came just before darkness. In 72 hours, a mission request would arrive. In 96 hours, a shot would be taken that would either validate 68 years of silence or prove that speaking truth had always been the harder, braver choice. Elle cleaned her rifle one more time, checked the scope, ran her fingers over the stock where Ruth's hands had once rested, where frostbite had numbed her grandmother's fingers but never her resolve, and made a promise to a woman she'd barely known but whose legacy she carried in her eyes, in her hands, in every shot she took. This shot would count, not just in the official record, though that mattered, but in the deeper accounting, the one that measured whether silence protected or just postponed, whether patience was wisdom or just fear with better branding. Ruth had written once about distance, about the space between who you are and who they see. Elle understood now. That distance wasn't measured in yards or meters or the trajectory of bullets. It was measured in the gap between what you accepted and what you demanded, between the story they told and the truth you lived. And in 72 hours, she was going to collapse that distance one shot at a time. The mission request came at 3:47 hours, delivered through encrypted channels with the kind of clinical precision that turned human lives into operational parameters. JSOC didn't ask. They required. High-value target designated Khalid Ahmadi, Taliban commander, financier, architect of the IED network that had turned supply routes into graveyards and young soldiers into statistics their families would carry forever. Elle read the briefing on Major Vic's tablet in the pre-dawn darkness of the operations center, the blue light making everyone look like ghosts. Distance, 2,147 meters. Wind, variable 12 to 18 miles per hour, crossfully thermals creating unpredictable layers. Target exposure window, estimated 90 seconds, maybe less. Civilian density, high. The last line made her pause. Rules of engagement, precision elimination only. No indirect fire authorized. No close air support available due to civilian proximity. Single-shot solution required. They're asking for a miracle, Chen said, reading over her shoulder. Cross stood by the window, looking out at mountains that held the target compound somewhere in their folds. He'd been awake all night. Elle could see it in the way he held himself, the particular stillness of a man who'd stopped sleeping well 68 years ago and never relearned the skill. Ruth made this shot, he said without turning around. December 1951, mountain ridge overlooking Chinese positions. 1,800 meters, worse wind than this, sub-zero temperatures that affected every variable. She made it look easy. It wasn't, but she made it. Vic set down the tablet. Brennan's already seen the tasking. He'll assign Harmon within the hour. Standard procedure would be to use our most qualified sniper, but standard procedure stopped applying the moment Elle's last name appeared in the system. Let him assign Harmon. Elle's voice was calm, empty, the same tone she'd used accepting credit theft for 4 months, but something underneath had changed, hardened. Harmon can't make the shot, he knows it, we know it. Eventually, Brennan will have to know it too. And then what? Vic asked. You think he'll just hand you the rifle and admit he was wrong? No, Cross turned from the window. He'll try to scrub the mission, call it too risky, recommend alternative approaches that don't exist. He'll do everything except admit that the woman he's trying to erase is the only one who can do the job. His eyes found Elle's. That's when we force the choice. Make it so public, so documented that burying you buries the mission. And Brennan cares more about his legacy than his grudge. At least I hope he does. The plan had the elegant simplicity of good tactics. Let Brennan make his play, document the failure. Then put Elle in position with enough witnesses that erasure would require conspiracy on a scale even Brennan couldn't orchestrate. It should have felt clean, righteous, even. But Elle kept thinking about her grandmother's letter. Don't fight, just shoot straight. This wasn't shooting straight. This was chess, politics. The same game Ruth had refused to play because playing meant accepting that excellence alone wasn't enough. That skill required performance and documentation and witnesses, or it would be erased like frost in sunlight. She wouldn't have wanted this, Elle said quietly. Ruth, she would have told me to take the shot if they gave it to me, stay quiet if they didn't. Cross's expression carried 68 years of regret. Your grandmother was wrong. I love her memory, I honor her choice, but she was wrong. Silence didn't protect her. It erased her. And the only reason we're standing here with any proof she existed is because I broke my promise and kept the record she told me to destroy. He picked up the tablet, looked at Ahmadi's face in the intelligence photo. 14 soldiers dead from his IED network. How many more before someone stops him? How many more while Brennan plays politics with the one person who can make this shot? The math was brutal, simple. Elle had run it a dozen times in the hour since the briefing arrived. Ahmadi was moving in 72 hours. The window was closing. If this mission failed, if the shot wasn't taken, the next IED would kill someone. Maybe multiple someones. Young soldiers who'd enlisted for reasons both noble and desperate, who'd left families and futures behind to serve, who deserved to come home. The distance between politics and body bags wasn't measured in yards. It was measured in the time it took to build the next bomb. "All right," Elle said. "We do it your way, we make it public, we force the choice." Vic nodded, pulled out her phone, started making calls that would set in motion a sequence of events that couldn't be reversed. Cross returned to the window, looking east where the sun would rise soon, painting the mountains the color of old blood. Chen stood beside Elle in the silence after everyone else had moved to their tasks. "Your grandmother's letter," he said. "The one that told you not to fight. Did it say why?" Elle thought about the words she'd read so many times they were etched in memory deeper than the rifle sight picture. She said the truth is in the distance, that the target is the only judge that matters, that fighting the system meant giving it power over you. But she kept the journal, documented every shot. That's not surrender, that's evidence. Evidence nobody saw for 68 years. Because nobody was looking. Chen's voice carried certainty. But we're looking now. Cross is looking. Vic is looking. And in about 6 hours, when Harmon admits he can't make this shot, a lot more people are going to be looking. Your grandmother kept the record so that one day someone would ask the right questions. Today's that day. The sun rose over Camp Vanguard at 6:23 hours, and with it came Captain Bradley Harmon, walking across the compound, toward the operations center with the stride of a man who didn't know his inadequacy was about to become public record. He was 33, West Point educated, qualified expert marksman on every range that mattered to career progression. None of those ranges had been longer than 900 meters. None of them had involved wind that could shift 15 degrees in the time it took a bullet to fly. Brennan met him at the door. Elle watched from inside through the window Cross had been standing at earlier. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read body language the way snipers learn to read mirage patterns. Harmon's posture went rigid. Brennan's hand on his shoulder, the gesture that looked supportive but carried the weight of command. The folder passed between them, Harmon opening it, his face going pale. 2 minutes later, they entered the operations center together. Brennan's expression was carefully neutral. Harmon looked like a man who'd just been told to jump off a cliff and was trying to calculate if he'd survive the fall. "Captain Harmon will be primary operator for the Ahmadi mission," Brennan announced to the room. His eyes swept past Elle like she was furniture. "Senior Chief Ortega from SEAL Team 7 will provide spotting support. Mission timeline is 48 hours. Wheels up at 400 tomorrow for position reconnaissance." Harmon opened his mouth, closed it. The internal struggle was visible, playing out across his features like weather systems colliding. Elle recognized it. The same calculation she'd been making for 4 months. The distance between what you knew was right and what you knew was safe. "Sir," Harmon said, voice tight. "Request to review the shot parameters with Senior Chief Ortega before accepting mission assignment." Brennan's jaw tightened. "The parameters are in the briefing, Captain. Range, wind, exposure window, standard long-range interdiction." 2,100 meters isn't standard, sir. That's extreme range. I'm qualified to 1,800 meters, max tested distance 900. I need to be honest about my capabilities before accepting this mission. The room went silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Brennan's careful neutrality cracked just slightly, enough to show the anger underneath. "Captain, are you refusing a direct mission assignment?" "No, sir. I'm requesting tactical assessment before deployment to ensure mission success. If there's a more qualified operator available, integrity requires me to recommend them." Harmon's eyes cut to Elle for just a moment. The gesture was small but unmistakable. Brennan saw it. Vic saw it. Cross saw it. The whole room saw it, and the thing that had been subtext became text, the unspoken made explicit. "Sergeant Garrison is reassigned," Brennan said flatly. "She's not available for this mission." "Sir, with respect, she's standing right here. And according to the duty roster, her reassignment doesn't take effect for another 60 hours. This mission launches in 24. Brennan's face went rigid. "Captain, you're out of line." "Sir, I'm trying to keep good soldiers alive. Ahmadi's IED network has killed 14 of ours. If I take this shot and miss because I'm not qualified, that number goes up. And the next soldier who dies, that's on me. On us. On every person in this room who knew there was a better option and chose politics over mission success." The words hung in the air like the moment between lightning and thunder. Harmon was burning his career in real time, and everyone knew it. But he was also speaking a language that military culture understood at its core. Mission first. Politics last. The hierarchy of values that was supposed to matter more than rank or gender or 68-year-old grudges. Brennan looked around the room, calculating. Vic's face was neutral, but her posture said she'd back Harmon's assessment. Cross stood with his arms crossed, radiating the particular authority of a man who'd earned his rank in ways that couldn't be taken away by retirement. Chen had his phone out, not even pretending he wasn't recording. "This is highly irregular," Brennan said, voice cold. "Sir, with respect, so is reassigning your most qualified sniper 48 hours before a critical mission." Harmon's voice was steady now, committed. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something stronger. "I'm requesting Senior Chief Ortega assess both my capabilities and Sergeant Garrison's for this specific mission. Let him make the tactical recommendation based on skill, not on anything else." Before Brennan could respond, the door opened. The man who entered was 46 years old, compact and weathered, with the particular look of someone who'd spent 20 years doing things civilians would never believe. Senior Chief Daniel Ortega, SEAL Team 7, sniper instructor, holder of the third longest confirmed kill in naval special warfare history at 2,387 meters. He looked at Brennan, then at Harmon, then at Elle. "I understand we have a mission parameter discussion," he said, voice flat, giving nothing away. "Permission to assess available operators, Colonel." Brennan was trapped. Refusing would be admitting the decision was political, not tactical. Accepting meant risking that Ortega would validate what everyone in the room already knew. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20. "Fine," Brennan said finally. "You have 6 hours, Senior Chief. Make your assessment. Report back at 1400 hours." He left, walked out of the operations center with the precise controlled movements of a man holding fury on a very short leash. The door closed behind him with a sound like a guillotine. Ortega looked at Harmon. "Captain, you just ended your career for this." Harmon shrugged. "Sir, I have a daughter. She's 7. I'd rather her grow up knowing her father was honest than successful." Something in Ortega's expression shifted, softened just slightly. "All right, let's see what we're working with. Garrison, Harmon, grab your rifles. We're going to the range." The long-range qualification course at Camp Vanguard stretched across broken terrain that mimicked the mountains where Ahmadi was hiding. Targets at 800, 1,000, 1,200, 1,500, and 1,800 meters. Wind flags every 200 meters showing the chaotic air currents that made long shots more art than science. Harmon went first. He was competent at 800, solid at 1,000, struggling at 1,200. At 1,500, he took 4 shots to get a hit. At 1,800, he fired 6 times and missed every one. "Wind's reading different at that range," he said, lowering his rifle. "I'm not getting the calls right." Ortega, watching through a spotting scope, nodded. "You're reading the flags near you and assuming they match downrange. They don't. Wind at 1,800 meters is a different animal. It's got layers, thermals, ground effects. You need to read the mirage between you and the target, not the flags." "I don't know how to read mirage at that distance, sir." "I know, it takes years to learn. Most snipers never do." Ortega turned to Elle. "Garrison, you're up." Elle moved to the firing line, settled into prone position with the familiarity of ritual, breathing cycle, cheek weld, sight picture. The rifle was an extension of her body, the scope an extension of her eyes. She'd fired this weapon so many times that the variables were instinct: trigger pull weight, recoil pattern, the exact point where the break would come. She fired. The 800-meter target showed immediate impact, center mass. She adjusted, fired again, 1,000 meters, hit. The rhythm built. Each shot a conversation with physics, with wind, with the distance that collapsed when you understood it wasn't empty space but a medium with texture and current and personality. At 1,500 meters, she held for 8 seconds, feeling the wind shift, waiting for the lull. Fired. Hit. At 1,800 meters, she took her time. This was the distance where most shooters failed, where the math got complicated and the wind became malicious. She watched the mirage dance above the rocks between her and the target, saw the pattern, the rhythm, the places where the air was calm and the places where it boiled. She fired. 4 seconds of flight. The bullet dropped 60 feet from bore line, drifted 8 feet left, and impacted 2 inches from center mass. Ortega lowered his spotting scope, looked at Elle, then at Harmon, then back at Elle. "Again," he said, "same target, cold bore." Elle cleared her chamber, reloaded, let the rifle cool, started the process again, reading the wind, feeling the distance. The second shot hit 3 inches from the first. "Jesus," Harmon whispered. Ortega stood up, walked to where Elle lay prone, knelt beside her. "Who taught you to read mirage like that?" "My grandmother, through my father. She learned it in Korea." "Ruth Garrison." It wasn't a question. Ortega had done his research. "I heard stories about her, ghost sniper, Chosin Reservoir. Never confirmed because the army didn't want to admit they had a woman in combat." He looked at the target, 1,800 meters away, showing 2 hits that could be covered by a playing card. The stories didn't do her justice. Cross had been watching from the elevated observation point. He came down now, moving with the careful deliberation of age trying not to look aged. "Senior Chief, I spotted for Ruth. Winter of 1951. Chosin Reservoir perimeter. I watched her make shots that shouldn't be possible. Distances nobody talks about because they sound like lies. And I watched the army erase every single one because her existence was inconvenient to the narrative." Ortega was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what Cross was describing. "My first platoon chief had an uncle, served in Korea, Marine Recon, Winter 51, got ambushed, entire patrol pinned down. He said a sniper pulled them out. 11 Chinese soldiers eliminated in sub-zero conditions. Saved 8 Marines. He tried to find out who it was to say thank you. Was told the records were classified. It was like the shooter never existed." He looked at Elle. "Your grandmother?" "Most likely, sir. December 9, 1951. Cross was her spotter." Cross nodded. "Major McAllister's patrol. Ruth made 11 shots in the worst conditions I've ever seen. Cold so intense that rifles jammed, Fingers froze, breathing created ice crystals that interfered with scopes, and she made it look routine. Ortega pulled out his phone, made a call. "Commander, it's Ortega. I'm at Camp Vanguard doing sniper assessment for the Almaty mission. I need to submit a tactical recommendation and you're not going to like it, but it's the right call." Pause. "No, sir. Captain Harmon is competent but not qualified for this range. I have another operator, Staff Sergeant Elena Garrison. She just put 2 cold bore shots into an 1,800-meter target with a 4-inch group, in variable wind, using a weapon she's only had for 4 months. The voice on the other end was loud enough that Elle could hear it from 6 feet away, though not clear enough to make out words. Ortega's expression didn't change. "Sir, I understand the political considerations. I also understand that if this mission fails because we put an unqualified operator in position, soldiers die. More soldiers than have already died from Almaty's network." Pause. "Yes, sir. I'm aware of her gender. I'm more aware of her skill. And with respect, sir, if we're making tactical decisions based on what's between an operator's legs instead of what's between their crosshairs, we deserve to fail." The silence after he hung up was profound. Ortega looked at Elle, then at Cross, then at Harmon. "My commander wants to review the footage before making a recommendation to JSOC. Chen, you got this on video." Chen held up his phone. "Every shot, sir, multiple angles." "Send it to me. I'll forward it up the chain." Ortega started packing his spotting scope. "Garrison, you need to understand something. If you get this mission, you're not just making a shot. You're making a statement, and statements have consequences. There are people in this command structure who will never forgive you for being better than they wanted you to be." "I know, sir." "Do you? Because your grandmother knew too, and she spent 68 years erased from the record. Being right doesn't protect you. Sometimes it just paints a target on your back." Elle thought about Ruth's letter, about the journal with 40 entries that nobody saw, about the Distinguished Service Cross recommendation stamped DENIED, about 68 years of silence that had protected nothing except the comfort of men who couldn't handle being surpassed. "Sir, my grandmother made her choice. She chose silence because she thought it would let her keep working, and maybe it did for a while. But eventually they found a reason to discharge her anyway, and the silence just meant nobody knew what they'd lost." Elle started breaking down her rifle. "I'm making a different choice. I'm going to take the shot if they give it to me, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows." Ortega smiled. It was a hard smile, the kind that came from 20 years of watching politics trump tactics. "Good. Because in about 6 hours, Colonel Brennan is going to get a recommendation from SEAL Team 7 that you're the only qualified operator for this mission. And he's going to have to decide if his grudge against a dead woman matters more than mission success." At 1400 hours, the operations center filled with people who had no official reason to be there, but understood that what was happening mattered beyond the immediate tactical situation. Ortega presented his findings with the clinical precision of someone who'd learned to make recommendations that couldn't be dismissed without exposing the politics underneath. Harmon's assessment, competent to 1,200 meters, struggling beyond that, unqualified for the 2,147-meter shot required by the Almaty mission. Recommendation, not suitable for this specific operation. Garrison's assessment, expert level to 1,800 meters, demonstrated capability for extreme range shots with minimal wind miscall rate. Recommendation, primary operator for Almaty mission. The video played on the main screen. Elle's 2 shots at 1,800 meters, grouped so tight they looked like a single impact from the camera angle. Then Harmon's attempts at the same range, all misses, the frustration visible in his body language. Brennan watched in silence. His face was carved from stone, giving nothing away. When the video ended, he looked at Ortega. Senior Chief, I appreciate your tactical assessment. However, I have concerns about operational security. Sergeant Garrison's reassignment was initiated for specific reasons related to force protection and unit cohesion. Sir, with respect, those concerns seem to have emerged very recently. Garrison has been operating successfully for 4 months. Her record shows consistent performance and zero operational security incidents. Nevertheless, the reassignment stands. Vic stepped forward. Colonel, if I may, the JSOC tasking specifically requests our most qualified extreme-range operator. If we fail to provide that operator for reasons unrelated to tactical capability, we're in violation of our support agreement with Joint Special Operations Command. That violation would require written justification submitted through Theater Command. It was a careful trap. Brennan could refuse Elle, but he'd have to document why. And documentation meant creating a paper trail that connected a 68-year grudge to current operational decisions. It meant exposing what everyone in the room already knew, but nobody could prove. I'll submit the justification, Brennan said. Sir, you'll need to copy SEAL Team 7 Command, JSOC, and Theater Special Operations. Standard procedure for mission capability disputes. Vic's voice was neutral, but her eyes were steel. They'll want to know why we're providing a less qualified operator when a more qualified one is available. Cross spoke from the back of the room. They'll also want to know why that decision was made by an officer who served with the more qualified operator's grandmother in Korea, and who was instrumental in having that grandmother's combat record classified and buried. Everyone turned. Cross stood with his arms crossed, old but unbowed. Colonel Brennan, I served with you in Korea. Winter of '51. I watched you witness Ruth Garrison's capabilities firsthand. I watched you struggle with the fact that she could outshoot you, outshoot all of us, in conditions that should have made accurate shooting impossible. And I watched you, years later, help bury her Distinguished Service Cross recommendation, because acknowledging her would mean acknowledging you'd been wrong. Brennan's face went white, then red. That's enough, Master Sergeant. You're a civilian now. You have no authority in this command. No, sir, I don't. But Senator Marcus McAllister does. He's the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He's also the officer whose life Ruth saved in Korea when she made 11 impossible shots while you were back at the warming tent. And he's very interested in why the granddaughter of the woman who saved his life is being benched by the same officer who erased her grandmother's record. The threat was explicit now, public. Brennan could dig in, but it would cost him. The documentation Cross had kept, the video Chen had filmed, the SEAL Team 7 recommendation, the senator who owed Ruth a debt that had compounded interest for 68 years. All of it pointed toward a choice Brennan didn't want to make but couldn't avoid. He could sacrifice his grudge, or he could sacrifice his legacy, but he couldn't have both. The silence stretched. 30 seconds. A minute. Brennan looked at Elle, and in his eyes she saw something that might have been hate, or might have been fear, or might have been the terrible understanding that he'd lost a fight he'd been winning for 68 years. Fine, he said finally, voice clipped, cold. Garrison is assigned to the Almaty mission, primary operator. Senior Chief Ortega will provide spotting support. Mission brief at 1800 hours. Wheels up at 400 tomorrow. He looked at Cross. But this conversation isn't over, Master Sergeant, not by a long shot. No, sir, Cross agreed. It's not. Because when Elle makes this shot, we're going to make sure everyone knows. And then we're going to correct Ruth's record, all of it. The 40 kills, the lives saved, the Distinguished Service Cross recommendation you helped bury. We're going to give her back the legacy you stole. Brennan left without another word. The door closed behind him with finality. In the silence that followed, Harmon exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for an hour. "Well," he said, "that was terrifying." Ortega smiled. "Welcome to the right side of history, Captain. It's uncomfortable here, but the view's better." Elle stood alone in the operations center after everyone else had filtered out to prepare for the mission. The sun was setting again, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rust. In 12 hours, she'd be in those mountains, prone behind a rifle, making a shot that would either validate 68 years of silence or prove that speaking truth was worth the cost. She thought about Ruth, 23 years old in frozen Korea, making the same choice in reverse, accepting erasure for the privilege of continued service, choosing silence because fighting seemed futile, because excellence should speak for itself, because maybe, just maybe, if she did the work well enough, someone would notice. Someone had noticed. Chen's grandfather had noticed. The soldiers she'd saved had noticed. Cross had noticed. But notice without acknowledgement was just another kind of erasure, and Ruth had carried that weight to her grave. Elle pulled out her grandmother's journal, opened to shot number 33. 3 targets, 12 seconds. The entry was sparse, clinical, giving nothing away about the fear or adrenaline or crushing weight of responsibility that came with those 12 seconds. But underneath the numbers, Ruth had written something else. Something Elle had read 100 times but understood differently now. Impossible just means nobody's done it yet. We did it. They lived. That's all that matters. But it wasn't all that mattered, Elle understood now. It should have been. In a better world, in a fairer system, excellence would have been enough. But this world, this system, required more. It required witnesses, documentation, people willing to risk their careers to speak truth. It required fighting when fighting seemed futile, because silence didn't protect. It just gave cover to those who wanted erasure. She closed the journal, put it in her pack next to her rifle cleaning kit and the photo of Ruth at 23. Tomorrow she'd carry them both into the mountains. Tomorrow she'd make a shot that her grandmother had made in far worse conditions 68 years ago. But this time, someone would be watching. This time, someone would be documenting. This time, the silence would break. Outside, Cross stood watching the sunset. Elle joined him. They didn't speak for a long time. Just watched the light fade from the sky and thought about the woman they both carried, each in their own way. Ruth Garrison, ghost sniper, erased legend, grandmother and mentor, and the reason they were standing here preparing to fight a battle she'd surrendered. "She'd be proud," Cross said finally. "Scared for you, but proud." "How do you know?" "Because I knew her, and she wasn't afraid of excellence. She was afraid of what happened to excellent women in a system designed to diminish them. But you're not alone the way she was. You've got backup, witnesses, people who won't stay silent." He looked at Elle. "That makes all the difference." The night came on fast, the way it did in the mountains. Stars emerged, cold and distant and indifferent to human struggles. Somewhere in those mountains, Ahmadi was planning the next attack. Somewhere, soldiers were loading onto convoys that would drive roads seeded with explosives designed to kill efficiently and without warning. Somewhere, families were waiting for phone calls that would change everything. And tomorrow, if everything went right, if the shot broke clean and the wind held steady, and the distance collapsed the way it should, one less bomb maker would be planning attacks. One less IED would be buried. One less family would get that call. That was the work. That was what Ruth had understood better than anyone. The shots mattered not because they got you recognition, but because they saved lives. The distance you collapsed wasn't between you and fame. It was between threat and safety, between violence and peace, between soldiers and the homes they were trying to reach. Elle understood that now. Understood why Ruth had chosen silence, even if Elle was choosing differently. They were both trying to collapse the same distance, just using different methods, different strategies for the same war. Tomorrow would tell which strategy worked. Tomorrow, the shot would either speak louder than 68 years of silence, or it would disappear into the same void that had swallowed Ruth's 40 kills. But either way, Elle would take it, because that's what snipers did. They made the impossible look inevitable. They collapsed distance that shouldn't collapse. They did the work that needed doing, whether anyone was watching or not. And if someone was watching this time, if the documentation held and the witnesses spoke, and the truth finally emerged from decades of deliberate darkness, then maybe Ruth's silence hadn't been for nothing. Maybe it had just been waiting for the right moment to break. That moment was 12 hours away. Elle went to clean her rifle and prepare her gear and sleep the light sleep of soldiers before combat. In the morning, she'd wake before dawn and carry her grandmother's legacy into the mountains. The shot was coming, the distance was waiting, and 68 years of silence was about to find its voice. The helicopter lifted off at 3:47 hours, engines screaming against the pre-dawn silence, rotors beating the air into submission. Elle sat in the cargo bay with her rifle case between her knees, watching Camp Vanguard shrink into a constellation of lights against the darkness. Beside her, Ortega checked his gear with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this enough times that ritual replaced thought. Chen sat across from them, helmet cam already recording, documenting everything because documentation was the only thing standing between truth and erasure. Cross hadn't come. Too old for field deployment, he'd said, but Elle had seen him standing at the edge of the landing zone as they'd loaded, a silhouette against the floodlights, watching like a man sending soldiers into battle he couldn't fight himself. 68 years of guilt and regret compressed into that single moment of observation. She'd nodded to him. He'd raised one hand, not a wave, not a salute, just acknowledgement. The passing of something that couldn't be named, but had weight nonetheless. The flight was 90 minutes of darkness and noise and the particular tension that comes before violence. Elle didn't sleep, didn't try. Instead, she ran through the calculations in her mind. Range, 2,147 meters. Elevation difference, 340 feet, target below firing position. Wind. Forecast said 12 to 18 miles per hour, but forecasts lied in mountains. Temperature, 48 degrees at departure, would climb to 60 by mid-morning when the shot window opened. All variables that would affect bullet trajectory, that would turn physics into probability and probability into prayer. She thought about Ruth making similar calculations 68 years ago. Different war, different mountains, but the same math. The same understanding that at extreme range, you weren't just fighting the target. You were fighting air density and Coriolis effect and the curvature of the Earth itself. You were trying to thread a needle from half a mile away while the needle moved, and the thread bent, and everything conspired to prove that what you were attempting was impossible. Except Ruth had done it 40 times in conditions that made Afghanistan look comfortable. Proved impossible was just a word people used before someone accomplished it. And now Elle was going to do it again, but this time with witnesses. This time with documentation. This time in a way that couldn't be erased or buried or dismissed as myth. The helicopter descended into a valley that looked like every other valley in Afghanistan, all rock and scrub, and the kind of desolation that made you understand why empires came here to die. They landed on a ridge 3 kilometers from the target compound, far enough that rotor noise wouldn't alert anyone, close enough that the climb would be manageable. The SEAL security team was already in position. 4 operators, faces painted, weapons ready, creating a perimeter that would keep Elle and Ortega alive long enough to do the work. Their team leader, a lieutenant named Morrison, gave Ortega a nod. Position is secure. We've got eyes on the compound. No movement yet, but thermal shows bodies inside. At least 6, maybe 8. Civilians, Ortega asked. Can't tell from this range. Could be family. Could be fighters. Intel says Ahmadi travels with minimal security to avoid attention, but minimal for him means at least 2 bodyguards. And the target exposure window. Morrison pulled out a tablet, showed them thermal imagery from a drone orbiting at 20,000 feet. Pattern of life analysis shows someone matching Ahmadi's build exits the main structure every morning between 6:30 and 7:15. Walks to that vehicle there. He pointed to a heat signature that resolved into a Toyota Hilux when the image clarity increased. Spends about 90 seconds doing a visual security check before getting in. That's your window. 90 seconds. Elle had made shots in less time, but never at this range, never with this much riding on it. She looked at the compound through her binoculars. Flat-roofed buildings arranged around a central courtyard, typical rural Afghan construction. Walls high enough for privacy, low enough that they wouldn't stop a bullet. The vehicle parked in morning shadow, which meant heat shimmer wouldn't be a factor. Small blessings. "What's the civilian density?" she asked. Morrison's expression darkened. "Hi, there's a school about 200 meters east, houses all around. This isn't open desert, it's populated area. That's why they won't authorize indirect fire or close air. You miss, the round goes into someone's kitchen. You miss high, it goes into that school." The weight of it settled onto Elle's shoulders like a physical thing. This wasn't just about making an impossible shot. It was about making it so precisely, so perfectly, that collateral damage was mathematically eliminated. One shot, one target, anything else was failure. They climbed. The ridge offered good elevation, good sight lines, but the approach was steep enough that Elle's legs burned and her breathing came hard. Ortega moved like a man half his age, SEAL conditioning making the vertical distance irrelevant. Chen struggled but kept pace, refusing to show weakness even though his role was documentation, not combat. They reached the final position at 5:23 hours. Ortega ranged the target with his laser designator. 2147 meters, call it 7,043 feet. Elevation angle -18 degrees. He punched numbers into a ballistic computer old-school Kestrel device that had been calculating death since before smartphones existed. At this range, bullet drop is 63.2 feet. Time of flight, 4.1 seconds. Wind is the variable. Elle set up her rifle. The Mk-22 MRAD wasn't the weapon she'd trained with most, but it was what JSOC had provided, and at this level, the shooter mattered more than the tool. She checked the scope, verified 0, ran through her pre-shot checklist with the kind of focused attention that turned chaos into controllable variables. Ortega was on the spotting scope, scanning the compound, reading the wind. "I'm seeing flags at the compound showing wind from the west at maybe 10 miles per hour, but between us and them, there's a valley that's going to create thermal layers. Air temperature down there is probably 10 degrees warmer than up here. That creates vertical wind shear." "How much drift are we talking?" "Best guess, somewhere between 8 and 14 feet, but it's not steady. It's pulsing with the thermals. You're going to have to read the mirage and time it for a lull." Elle looked through her scope at the space between her position and the target. The air wasn't invisible, not if you knew how to see it. Mirage created by heat differential made the image waver, made solid objects seem to dance. But the dancing had rhythm, pattern. You could read it the way musicians read sheet music, finding the tempo underneath the chaos. She'd learned this from her father, who'd learned it from Ruth, who'd learned it from necessity and 1,000 hours of observation in conditions far worse than this. In Korea, Ruth had to account for frozen air layers, temperature inversions, wind patterns complicated by sub-zero conditions. What Elle was facing now was difficult. What Ruth had faced then was nearly impossible. Wind wasn't random. It was fluid dynamics. It had eddies and currents and places where different streams met and created turbulence. If you watched long enough, if you understood the terrain and the temperature and the way air moved through space, you could find the moments of relative calm, the beats between the chaos where a shot might fly true. "I need to watch it," Elle said. "See the pattern, learn the rhythm." Ortega nodded. "You've got time, sun's not up yet. Amadi won't move until full light." They waited. This was the part civilians didn't understand about sniping. The part movies never showed because it was boring, because it was just lying in dirt watching air currents and feeling your body slowly become part of the landscape. Hours of nothing punctuated by seconds of everything. The sun rose at 6:12 hours, painting the mountains in shades of copper and gold. Elle watched the compound come to life, thermal signatures moving inside buildings. Someone starting a fire, smoke rising straight up for 20 feet before wind caught it and bent it west. That told her something. Surface wind was calm. Upper air was moving. The bullet would fly through both. At 6:35, the door opened. A man emerged. Elle's heartbeat picked up, adrenaline flooding her system even though training said stay calm, stay steady, don't let chemistry override skill. But this was it. This was the moment. Except it wasn't. The man was too short, wrong build, moved without the careful awareness of someone important enough to be hunted. Probably a guard doing morning rounds. "Not him," Ortega confirmed. "Keep watching." Elle controlled her breathing, brought her heart rate down. The trick was treating false alarms like practice, not letting the adrenaline dump waste itself on targets that didn't matter. Save it, store it, release it only when the moment was real. 6:47. Another man emerged, taller, right build, but he turned and Elle could see his face clearly enough through the scope to know it wasn't Amadi. Intel had provided detailed photographs, facial structure, gait analysis. The way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right from an old injury. This wasn't him. "Still waiting," Ortega said. His voice was calm, patient. The sound of someone who'd done this enough times that waiting was just part of the work. Chen, filming everything, shifted position slightly. "How long can you hold position like that?" he whispered to Elle. "As long as it takes." Her voice was barely audible. When you were prone this long, you became the ground, breathing shallow, movement minimal, heart rate controlled. The rifle wasn't something you held. It was an extension of your body, and your body was an extension of the earth itself. Ruth had written about this in the journal. Shot number 17. Korea winter. Waited 6 hours in -20 cold for target to appear. My fingers were numb. My body screamed. But when he showed, my body remembered what my mind had started to forget. The shot was clean. Elle understood now what Ruth had meant. The body kept score, remembered positions. If you stayed in the pocket long enough, muscle memory took over and conscious thought became interference. You didn't aim. You existed at the exact angle that turned intention into impact. 7:04. The door opened again. This time, Elle knew before Ortega spoke. Knew from the way the man moved, careful but not afraid, aware but not paranoid. The bearing of someone important who'd learned to hide it but couldn't quite eliminate the subtle signals that marked leadership. Target, Ortega breathed. Khalid Ahmadi, positive identification. Elle's world compressed. Everything that wasn't the shot ceased to exist. The scope showed Ahmadi walking toward the hillocks, flanked by 2 bodyguards. He was wearing a tan pakal hat, dark shalwar camis, moving with the unhurried pace of a man who didn't know death was watching from over a mile away. Ortega's voice became rhythm, metronome, the beat that would pace the shot. "Wind is 8 left, steady, wait for it, wait for it." Elle's breathing slowed, 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out, hold. The cycle that dropped heart rate, that made the scope's reticle stop dancing and settle into stillness. Through the scope, Amadi reached the vehicle, stopped, began his security check, looking at the wheels underneath the chassis, the ritual of a man who'd survived this long by being careful. Range unchanged, 2147, wind shifting, now 10 left, hold. The bodyguards were scanning the perimeter. One lit a cigarette. The other said something that made Amadi smile. Casual, normal. The last 90 seconds of a life that didn't know it was ending. Then everything changed. A child appeared. A girl, maybe 6 years old, running from one of the nearby houses. She had something in her hands, chasing it. A chicken. The bird was fleeing, wings flapping, kicking up dust. The girl was laughing, the sound carrying across the distance, faint and pure. And she ran directly into Elle's line of fire. "Child in the line," Ortega said, voice tight. "Hold, hold." Elle's finger was already on the trigger. Not pulling. Not yet. But the pressure was there, the muscle memory of 10,000 shots creating automatic response that had to be consciously overridden. She held. Watched. Amadi was at the vehicle door, opening it. 5 seconds, maybe less, and he'd be inside. Gone. The mission failed. But the girl was still in the line, still chasing the chicken, completely unaware that invisible geometry connected her to a moment of decision happening over a mile away. Chen's camera was recording. Ortega's spotter scope was locked. Everyone was watching. Everyone would see whatever choice Elle made next. And in that moment, she understood something Ruth must have understood 40 times. Being watched didn't make the shot easier. It made it heavier. Added weight that physics couldn't measure but shooters carried forever. The girl chased the chicken. The chicken zagged. The girl followed. The geometry shifted. Wind holding 10 left. Target entering vehicle. This is your window, 3 seconds. The girl was moving. The chicken was erratic. Amadi had 1 foot in the hillocks. Math and instinct collided in Elle's brain, calculating trajectories, predicting movement, gambling on chaos theory and the flight pattern of terrified poultry. The chicken would zig left, the girl would follow, the line would clear for 0.8 seconds, maybe. Elle watched, waited, the chicken zigged. The girl followed. Clear line, 0.7 seconds of geometry that would work, would let death travel unobstructed, would collapse the distance without destroying innocence in the process. Elle's exhale was complete. Her heart was between beats. The reticle was steady. Every variable aligned in that single moment of possibility that would never come again. She broke the trigger. The rifle recoiled. The scope jumped. Elle rode it, came back down, found the sight picture again. Now the waiting. Now the 4.1 seconds while physics and chemistry and ballistics turned intention into outcome. Through the scope she could see everything. Amadi starting to sit. The bodyguards relaxing. The girl grabbing the chicken, triumphant. None of them knowing that death was in flight, invisible, inexorable, approaching at 2,800 feet per second. The bullet arrived before the sound. Amadi's chest erupted. He dropped, half in the vehicle, half out, body going slack in the particular way that meant the nervous system had been catastrophically interrupted. The bodyguards froze for a full second, brains trying to process what eyes were seeing but couldn't understand. Then chaos. The bodyguards grabbed weapons, spinning, searching for threat they couldn't locate. The girl screamed, dropping the chicken, staring at the body. People poured from buildings, running, shouting, the compound transforming from peaceful mourning to active crisis in heartbeats. Ortega was on the radio. Target down, confirmed hit, 0 collateral, execute extraction. The SEAL security team moved immediately, pulling back from their positions, creating corridor for Elle and Ortega, and Chen to collapse into. Morrison was already calling for helicopter, setting up extraction point, doing the math of getting everyone out before the chaos below organized into response. Elle cleared her rifle, safed it. Her hands were shaking now, adrenaline finding release, the chemical weight of what she'd just done crashing through the discipline that had held it back. She'd killed a man, not in the abstract, not in the comfortable distance of policy and strategy. She'd ended a life from over a mile away, and the fact that he'd deserved it, that he'd killed others, that stopping him would save lives didn't change the fundamental truth. She'd pulled the trigger, he'd stopped existing, and a little girl was screaming. Ortega's hand on her shoulder was firm, grounding. You did good, clean shot, 0 civilian casualties. That was one of the finest pieces of shooting I've ever witnessed. That girl, Elle's voice was rough. She's going to have nightmares. That girl is alive because you waited, because you didn't take a shot that would have worked for you but not for her. That's judgment, Elle. That's what separates snipers from shooters. Anyone can pull a trigger. You made a choice. The right choice, Elle said quietly. But that doesn't mean she won't have nightmares. Neither will I. Ortega's expression softened. That's the difference between people who should be doing this work and people who shouldn't. You understand the weight. You'll carry this shot for the rest of your life, but you'll carry it knowing you made the right call. Your grandmother understood that, carried 40 shots for 68 years. Each one mattered. Each one had weight. Chen was breaking down his camera equipment, hands moving fast. We need to move. They're going to be looking for where that shot came from. They climbed down from the ridge, moving with the controlled urgency of people who understood that speed mattered but panic killed. The helicopter was already inbound, rotors audible before it was visible, the cavalry arriving to pull them out of enemy territory. As they ran, Elle kept seeing it, the girl's face. The moment she'd grabbed the chicken, the fraction of a second between clear line and catastrophe, she'd waited, made the right choice, but right didn't erase the weight. Ruth's journal had entries like this. Shot number 9, Korea winter, target eliminated. Civilian walked through line 2 seconds after bullet passed. I made the right call, so why do my hands shake? Because being good at killing didn't make you comfortable with it. Because the distance you collapsed wasn't just physical. It was moral, psychological. The space between necessity and choice, between warfare and murder, between what had to be done and what you'd have to live with afterward. The helicopter extracted them at 7:23 hours. As they lifted off, Elle looked back at the compound. Emergency vehicles were arriving. People were gathered around Ahmadi's body. The girl was being held by a woman, probably her mother, both of them alive because Elle had waited. 14 soldiers wouldn't die from Ahmadi's IED network now, wouldn't be shredded by explosives buried in roads they had to travel, wouldn't be sent home in boxes to families that would never be whole again. The math was brutal but simple. 1 death prevented 14, maybe more. But math didn't account for the girls screaming, didn't quantify trauma, didn't measure the cost extracted from the shooter who'd made precision killing look easy when it was anything but. Back at Camp Vanguard, they landed to a crowd. Word had spread. JSOC had confirmed the kill. Intelligence was already analyzing the impact, calculating how many lives had been saved, how much the IED network would be disrupted, what this meant for force protection across the region. Brennan was there, standing at the edge of the landing zone, arms crossed, face unreadable. He watched Elle exit the helicopter, watched Ortega and Chen and the SEAL team, watched the rifle case that held the weapon that had just made one of the longest confirmed kills in theater history. When Elle approached, he didn't speak, just looked at her with an expression that carried 68 years of complicated history compressed into a single moment of forced acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked away. Cross was there too. He moved forward slowly, old body protesting movement but making it anyway. When he reached Elle, he didn't say anything. Just pulled her into a hug that smelled like old coffee and older regret, and the particular relief of debts partially paid. "She'd be proud," he whispered, "scared for you but proud." Elle held on to him, this old man who'd carried her grandmother's memory for longer than Elle had been alive, who'd stayed silent when silence was easier and was speaking now when speech was hard. "Did you watch the feed?" she asked. Every second, the girl, the waiting, the shot. His voice cracked. Ruth made a shot just like that. Korea winter 1952, civilians everywhere, enemy combatants mixed with innocents. She waited until the geometry was perfect, until she knew beyond certainty that the bullet would find only the target. That's not just skill, that's character. Vic appeared with a tablet. "Elle, JSOC wants your after-action report. Ortega's too. They're fast-tracking this up the chain. CENTCOM commander wants to see the footage." "Why?" Vic's smile was tight. "Because you just made history. Longest confirmed kill by a woman in military history. Third longest overall in current operations. And you did it with civilian proximity that would have made most shooters abort." She looked at the tablet. "They're also asking about your availability for additional operations. Seems like word got out that we've been benching our best asset." The implications settled. This wasn't just about one shot anymore. It was about validation, recognition. The thing Ruth had been denied was being offered to Elle, and the offering came with its own complications. Because acceptance meant becoming visible, becoming target, becoming the thing that people would point to as either proof or exception, depending on their agenda. Chen appeared with his camera. "Elle, the footage is clean. Everything, the weight, the girl, the shot, the discipline, it's all there. Cross wants to send it to Senator McAllister, along with Ruth's documentation. He thinks this is the moment, the proof that will get her record corrected." "What does that mean for me?" "It means you become the granddaughter who vindicated the grandmother, the legacy case, the proof that erasure was wrong." Chen's expression was serious. "It also means you become political, whether you want to or not. Your shot stops being about tactics and starts being about symbols." Elle thought about Ruth's letter. Don't fight, just shoot straight. But Ruth had also kept the journal, had documented everything, had prepared for the possibility that someday someone would ask the right questions. Maybe she'd known. Maybe she'd understood that silence was temporary, that truth deferred wasn't truth denied, that legacies waited for their moment. This was the moment. The shot had been made. The witnesses had documented. The girl was alive. The target was dead. And 68 years of silence was straining against the weight of proof, ready to break. "Send it," Elle said. "Send all of it, the footage, Ruth's journal, the Distinguished Service Cross recommendation. Everything Cross has been keeping. Send it to the senator. Make it public. Make it so complete that burying it would require conspiracy." Chen nodded. Started uploading files, setting in motion a sequence of events that would ripple through military bureaucracy and political channels and media ecosystems, hungry for stories that fit narratives about progress and justice and wrongs being righted. That night, Elle sat alone in her tent, cleaning her rifle with the ritual attention that turned maintenance into meditation. The weapon had killed today, had ended a life from a distance most people couldn't conceptualize, had been the tool that collapsed space between threat and safety, between bomber and victims, between one man's malice and 14 soldiers' survival. But the weapon was neutral, metal and chemistry, physics incarnate. It didn't carry moral weight. That weight belonged to the shooter, to the person who'd made the choice to aim, to wait, to fire, to the woman who'd watched a little girl chase a chicken and decided that innocence mattered more than certainty, that getting the shot right was more important than getting the shot now. Ruth's journal was open beside her. Shot number 33. Korea winter. 3 targets, 12 seconds in sub-zero conditions. Impossible just means nobody's done it yet. Elle picked up a pen, turned to the first blank page after Ruth's final entry, the page that had been empty for 68 years, and wrote, Shot number 41. Range 2,147 meters, wind variable, civilian in line, waited for geometry, target eliminated, 0 collateral, 14 soldiers saved, 1 little girl alive. This is what the distance means, not yards, lives. She set down the pen. The entry sat there, linking past to future, Ruth's 40 to Elle's 1, the legacy continuing in the only way that mattered, not through recognition, not through medals or reports or official acknowledgement, but through the work, the shots, the lives saved, the distance collapsed. Outside, the camp was quiet. Somewhere in Washington, files were being reviewed. Footage was being analyzed. Senator McAllister was reading documents he'd been waiting 68 years to see. Wheels were turning, slowly but inevitably, toward something that might be justice or might just be acknowledgement, which wasn't the same thing but was better than erasure. And in the mountains where Ahmadi had died, a little girl was sleeping. Nightmares would come. Trauma would linger. But she was alive to have them. Alive because a woman over a mile away had cared more about precision than glory, more about innocence than efficiency. The shot was over. The bullet had found its target. The distance had collapsed. But the story was just beginning. Because truth, once released, didn't travel in straight lines. It rippled, echoed, found its way into spaces that had been kept dark through deliberate effort. And after 68 years of darkness, even a little light was blinding. Elle closed the journal, put away her cleaning kit, lay down on her cot and closed her eyes. Tomorrow there would be briefings and after-action reports and probably media attention she didn't want. Tomorrow the machinery of recognition would start grinding, turning her shot into symbol, her skill into narrative, her choice into political football. But tonight she'd done the work, made the shot, saved the lives, honored the legacy. That was enough. It had to be. Because anything more was just politics, and politics was noise. The work was the signal. The shot was the truth. The distance was the only judge that mattered. And the distance said she'd done it right. The call came at 2:14 hours, 48 hours after the Ahmadi shot. Elle woke from shallow sleep to her phone vibrating on the ammunition case she used as a nightstand. The number was unlisted, but the area code was Virginia, Washington. The machinery she'd set in motion calling back. Sergeant Garrison, this is Colonel Marcus McAllister. I apologize for the hour. Elle sat up, suddenly awake. The voice was older now, roughened by decades, but it still carried authority. This was the man Ruth had saved. The man who tried to give her a Distinguished Service Cross and been buried by the same bureaucracy that was calling now. Sir, no apology needed. I've spent the last 2 days reviewing footage of your shot, the documentation Cross sent, your grandmother's journal, the records they told me didn't exist. There was a pause, heavy with emotion barely controlled. 68 years. I've carried the memory of the woman who saved my life, and for 68 years I couldn't even prove she existed. Until now. Sir, I just did my job. No, Sergeant, you did more than that. You proved that the system that erased your grandmother was wrong. You gave me evidence, witnesses, documentation so complete that even career bureaucrats can't make it disappear. His voice hardened. And now I'm going to use it, every bit of it, but I need you to understand what that means. Elle waited. Outside, the camp was dark and quiet. Inside, she could feel the weight of history pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Colonel Brennan is going to fight this, McAllister continued. He's going to use every tool, every connection, every favor he's accumulated over 65 years. Because if Ruth's record gets corrected, if her service gets acknowledged, it exposes what he did. The erasure. The buried Distinguished Service Cross recommendation. The pattern of doing the same thing to other women over his entire career. I can handle Brennan, sir. I know you can, but there's something else. Something I need you to decide. McAllister's voice shifted, became more personal. The footage of your shot is spreading, not officially, not yet, but people talk, people share. By morning, half the special operations community is going to know that a woman just made one of the finest long-range shots in combat history, and they're going to want to use it as proof, as example, as ammunition in fights that have nothing to do with you. I understand, sir. Do you? Because once this becomes public, you stop being a soldier and become a symbol. Every time someone wants to talk about women in combat, they'll show your footage. Every time someone wants to talk about institutional bias, they'll mention your grandmother. You'll be a case study, an example, a thing people use to prove points you might not agree with. Elle thought about Ruth's letter, about choosing silence to avoid exactly this, about doing the work without becoming the debate. Sir, what would you have done if Ruth had lived, if you'd had the evidence then that you have now? The silence was long. When McAllister spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decades of regret. I would have fought. I should have fought harder than I did. But I was young, ambitious, afraid of what it would cost me. And I told myself that protecting the institution mattered more than protecting one soldier. He took a breath. I was wrong, and good soldiers died because of it. Because the woman who could have trained them, who could have passed on her knowledge, was instead erased and silenced and left to carry her skill to the grave. So you're saying I should go public? I'm saying the choice is yours, but if you make it, I'll back you. Senator's office, Armed Services Committee, every platform I can access. We'll correct Ruth's record. We'll make sure what happened to her doesn't happen to the next generation. But it's going to be a fight, and fights leave scars. Elle looked at the journal on her footlocker. Shot number 41, written in her handwriting below shot number 40 in Ruth's. 2 entries separated by 68 years but connected by the same choice. Do the work or fight the system. Except maybe the choice was false. Maybe doing the work and fighting the system were the same thing, just operating on different timescales. Sir, how many women have been erased the way Ruth was? Over the years, over the decades. More than I can count, more than I want to know. McAllister's voice went rough. Your grandmother wasn't the first, she wasn't the last, but she might be the one who changes the pattern if we fight, if we win. Then let's fight, sir. 24 hours later, Brennan called Elle to his office. The walk across camp felt like approaching execution. Not hers, his, but executions were violent regardless of who was dying. He was standing at his window when she entered, looking out at mountains that held secrets and violence in equal measure. He didn't turn when she saluted, didn't acknowledge her presence for 30 seconds that stretched like hours. I've received notification from CENTCOM, he said finally, voice flat, dead. They're conducting a historical review of sniper operations from the Korean War, specifically operations whose records were classified or incomplete. Your grandmother's name came up. Sorry. Senator McAllister is personally sponsoring the review. He's provided documentation, witness statements, after-action reports from 1951 and 1952 that somehow survived when everything else was purged. Brennan turned. His face was carved from granite. Tell me, Sergeant, did you plan this? The shot, the publicity, the perfect documentation. Was it all designed to embarrass me? Elle met his eyes. Sir, I planned to make the shot because soldiers' lives depended on it. The documentation was to prevent what happened to my grandmother from happening to me. If that embarrasses you, it's because your actions 68 years ago were embarrassing." Brennan's jaw tightened. "You have no idea what you're talking about, what it was like then, the pressure, the politics, the institutional resistance to change." "My grandmother lived it, sir. She didn't just observe the pressure, she was crushed by it. And you were one of the people operating the machinery." "I was following orders, protecting operational security, making hard choices in a hard war." "You were erasing excellence because it made you uncomfortable." Elle's voice stayed level, but something underneath was steel. "Ruth saved lives. Your major tried to recognize it. You helped bury it. And then you spent the next 68 years doing the same thing to every woman who reminded you that skill doesn't care about gender." Brennan's face went red. "You're out of line, Sergeant." "No, sir. I'm exactly on line. The line that connects my grandmother's erased 40 kills to my 14 that you tried to bury. The line that runs through every woman sniper who's been told she's not qualified when what you mean is not wanted." "This conversation is over." "Sir, with respect, it's been over for 68 years. You've been having it with yourself, fighting a battle against competence because competence in the wrong package threatened everything you built your identity on." Elle pulled out her phone, opened an email, turned it to show Brennan. "Senator McAllister sent me this an hour ago. It's the list of documentation he's submitting to the Army Historical Review Board, Ruth's after-action reports, Cross's witness statements, kill confirmations from soldiers she saved, and the Distinguished Service Cross recommendation you personally helped classify." Brennan looked at the screen. His face went pale. That was legal. That was proper classification of sensitive operations. It was erasure, and the Historical Review Board is going to say so. They're recommending Ruth be posthumously promoted to Sergeant Major, Silver Star for the Chosin operations, and they're reopening the Distinguished Service Cross review. 68 years late, but it's happening. The silence was profound. Brennan sat down heavily, suddenly looking all of his 86 years. "This will destroy what's left of my legacy." "Sir, your legacy was built on destroying hers. Maybe that was always going to have consequences." "What do you want from me? Apology? Confession? You've already won, you and Cross and that senator. You've got everything you wanted." Elle thought about what she wanted. Not revenge, not humiliation, something simpler and more complicated. "I want you to tell me why. Why her? Why so much effort to erase one woman? What was so threatening about my grandmother that you had to bury her?" Brennan was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was different, smaller, human in a way Elle hadn't heard before, because she was better, better than me, better than every man in the unit. And if we acknowledged it, if we let that truth become official, it meant everything we believed about ourselves was wrong. He looked at his hands, age-spotted and trembling slightly. "I was 18 years old, Private James Brennan, fresh from Paris Island, cocky, convinced I was special because I could shoot expert on the range. Then I got to Korea, Chosin Reservoir, December 1951. Temperature so cold that weapons jammed, men froze to death in their sleeping bags, and the only thing between us and being overrun was staying alert despite conditions that made alertness nearly impossible." He paused. Ruth was 23, Sergeant, already had months of combat experience, and I watched her make shots that defied everything I'd been taught. 11 Chinese soldiers, sub-zero conditions, variable wind, ranges where I couldn't even see the targets clearly. She eliminated them methodically, precisely, like she was on a training range instead of in the worst combat conditions of the war. "And that threatened you?" "It terrified me." Brennan's voice cracked. "Not the enemy, her, Because if a woman could outshoot me in conditions where I could barely function, what did that say about everything I believed? About who belonged in combat? About natural ability and gender and the order of things? He looked up at Elle. So when the opportunity came, when her Distinguished Service Cross recommendation was being processed, and someone asked for input from soldiers who'd served with her, I said what they wanted to hear. Questionable judgment, potential morale issues, not suitable for recognition. I was 18. I told myself I was protecting unit standards, maintaining discipline, but I was really just protecting my ego. And you never stopped. No, every woman I encountered over the next 68 years who reminded me of Ruth, who made me feel that same inadequacy, I found ways to minimize, to redirect, to ease out, not because they weren't good enough, because they were too good, because they made me confront a lie I'd built my entire identity around. He closed his eyes. I'm 86 years old, Sergeant, retired, called back as an advisor, and I see your name on a roster and I think not again. Not another Garrison making me feel small. So I try to bury you the same way I buried her, except this time there are witnesses, documentation, a senator who remembers, and an old man who kept records for 68 years. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm tired. Brennan opened his eyes. They were wet. Tired of defending a lie, tired of carrying the weight of what I did to Ruth, tired of running from a truth I've known for 68 years. Your grandmother was one of the finest soldiers I ever served with, and I helped erase her, and that makes me, he trailed off. Human, Elle said quietly. It makes you human, wrong but human. Elle hadn't slept well since Almaty. The girl's face visited her dreams, not the moment of the shot but the aftermath. The scream, the confusion. She'd wake at odd hours, heart racing, seeing the chicken zig and the girl follow and the geometry that had allowed death to pass without touching innocence. Chen had noticed during morning briefings, the slight dark circles, the way her hands would still occasionally. You okay? Elle had nodded. Ruth wrote in her journal once, shot number 17. Made the right call, so why do my hands shake? I understand now. Right doesn't erase weight, it just makes the weight worth carrying. Now, looking at Brennan broken and confessing, Elle understood another thing Ruth must have known. The people who erased you weren't monsters. They were just people who'd made bad choices and spent lifetimes defending them because admitting error meant confronting the architecture of their entire self-concept. Sir, what happens now? Now, Brennan seemed to come back from somewhere far away. Now I submit my testimony, full confession, document everything, every woman I helped sideline, every report I influenced, every time I chose protecting the institution over protecting the people in it. He pulled out a folder thick with papers. I started writing this 3 days ago, after I watched your shot, after I saw you wait for that child. After I realized that 68 years later, the Garrisons are still better than I'll ever be, and the only power I have left is to stop pretending they're not. You're going to destroy yourself. I'm going to tell the truth. If that destroys me, maybe I was built on lies. He handed her the folder. Give this to Cross, to McAllister, to whoever's building the case. Make sure Ruth's record is corrected. Make sure the 53 other women whose careers I impacted get reviewed. Make sure the system I helped perpetuate dies with me. Elle took the folder. It was heavy, not with paper but with decades. 53. 53 women I can document, probably more I've forgotten or didn't realize I was influencing. 68 years is a long time to be consistently wrong. Brennan stood, extended his hand. I won't ask forgiveness, don't deserve it, but I can try to make the wreckage less than it might have been. Elle shook his hand. It was dry, papery, trembling, the hand of an old man who'd finally stopped running. Sir, for what it's worth, I think my grandmother would have respected this. Not approved, but respected it. She was better than me in that too then. I don't even respect myself. 3 days later, Brennan submitted his resignation. Medical retirement, the paperwork said, but everyone knew. Within 24 hours, the Army Inspector General's office announced a comprehensive review of combat recognition practices spanning 7 decades. Within 48, news broke about a Korean War sniper whose record had been classified and was now being corrected. By 72 hours, Ruth Garrison's name was on CNN. Elle watched from her tent as her grandmother's story went public. Clips of Elle's shot, Ruth's journal entries, cross-interviewed, voice shaking with age and emotion. McAllister on the Senate floor, calling for systematic review of military personnel practices. The machinery had engaged, unstoppable now. Ruth was becoming what she'd never wanted to be, a symbol, a case study, evidence in arguments about institutional bias and gender and the cost of erasure. But she was also becoming acknowledged, recognized, given back the history that had been taken from her. Cross found Elle outside, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "It's done," he said. "The Army confirmed it. Full historical review. Ruth's getting the Silver Star, posthumous promotion to Sergeant Major, and they're reopening the Distinguished Service Cross recommendation with an eye toward upgrading it." Upgrading it to what? McAllister thinks Medal of Honor, says the 20-shot operation in May 1952 meets every criterion: extraordinary heroism, risk of life above and beyond, actions that saved American lives and prevented enemy victory. Cross's voice was rough. 68 years late, but it's happening. Elle thought about Ruth, about carrying excellence nobody acknowledged for 68 years, about dying without ever knowing the silence would break. She should be here to receive it. Yes, but she's not, so we receive it for her, and we make sure the next generation doesn't wait 68 years for acknowledgement. Cross looked at Elle. "You did this, your shot, your willingness to fight. You broke the pattern Ruth couldn't break." She broke it, she just didn't live to see it shatter. 6 weeks later, Elle stood at Arlington National Cemetery in dress uniform, the weight of medals on her chest feeling heavier than any rifle. Ruth's grave was simple, standard military stone, but today it was surrounded by flags and people, and the formal machinery of recognition delayed by nearly 7 decades. Senator McAllister spoke first, voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Military brass, veterans, media, family. "Sergeant Major Ruth Garrison saved my life on December 9, 1951. She made 11 impossible shots while under fire, eliminating enemy combatants who would have killed me and 7 of my men. I tried to recognize her service. The recommendation was buried, classified, disappeared." He paused, letting the weight of that erasure settle. "For 68 years I've carried that failure. Today we begin to correct it." He presented the Silver Star. Elle accepted it on Ruth's behalf, the medal feeling simultaneously too light and too heavy. Recognition delayed was recognition denied, but acknowledgement was better than erasure. Barely. Cross stood with her, 89 years old and straight in uniform he'd pulled from retirement for this day. He'd testified before the Historical Review Board, had submitted every document he'd kept in violation of classification orders, had spent 6 weeks being interviewed, deposed, questioned by people who wanted to understand how one woman could be so comprehensively erased. When it was Elle's turn to speak, she looked at the assembled crowd and thought about what Ruth would say. Probably nothing. Ruth had chosen silence, but Elle was choosing differently. "My grandmother made at least 60 confirmed kills in Korea, saved countless lives, trained soldiers who went on to train others, but for 68 years, her service didn't officially exist, not because she wasn't good enough, but because excellence in the wrong package threatens people who have built their identity on being the best. She looked at the military brass in attendance, some uncomfortable, some genuinely remorseful, all complicit in their silence. We're here today to correct one injustice, but Ruth wasn't the only one. Cross's testimony identified 53 other women whose combat contributions were minimized or erased. 53 we know about, probably more we don't. And correcting the record doesn't change the culture that created the erasure in the first place. Some faces hardened. This wasn't the grateful, humble speech they'd expected, but Elle wasn't interested in their expectations. My grandmother believed that excellence speaks for itself. She was wrong. Excellence gets silenced if the people watching don't want to hear it, so we have to speak louder, document better, fight harder. We have to make erasure impossible through sheer weight of evidence. She held up the silver star. This medal is 68 years late. It doesn't bring her back, doesn't erase the trauma of being erased, doesn't undo the damage of spending a lifetime knowing you did excellent work that nobody acknowledged. But it's a start, and we're not stopping here. The ceremony concluded with full military honors. 21-gun salute, taps played by a single bugler. The flag folded with precision and presented to Elle as next of kin. All the formal recognition that should have happened in 1954 but was delayed by bureaucracy and bias, and one private who couldn't handle being surpassed. After Cross stood with Elle at the grave, they didn't speak for a long time, just looked at the stone that now had additional text carved below Ruth's name and dates. Silver Star recipient, 60 confirmed kills, Chosin Reservoir, the history corrected, the record adjusted, the truth acknowledged. She'd hate this, Cross said finally. All this attention, all these people making her a symbol. Probably, but she'd accept it if it meant the next woman didn't have to be erased. You really think it'll change things? I think it has to, because the alternative is accepting that we learned nothing. That 68 years of injustice was just unfortunate, not systemic. That this was about individual bad actors instead of institutional failure. Elle looked at Cross. You kept the records for 68 years. That wasn't just about Ruth. That was about the pattern, about making sure eventually someone would have the evidence to prove this wasn't isolated. Cross nodded. I failed her by staying silent, but I didn't destroy the evidence, didn't let the truth disappear completely. I kept it because some part of me knew that silence deferred wasn't silence permanent, that eventually someone would ask the right questions, that eventually the weight would become too much to carry quietly. The weight broke, she'd be proud. She'd be proud of you. You're everything she wanted to be, skilled, recognized, fighting instead of accepting, changing what she couldn't. Cross pulled out the journal, the same leather journal that had traveled from Korea to Texas to Afghanistan to Arlington. This belongs with her. No, Elle pushed it back gently. It belongs with whoever comes next. The next woman who needs to know that excellence matters even when it's denied. That documentation matters even when it's buried. That silence is temporary, but truth is patient. Cross smiled, tucked the journal back into his jacket. Then you keep it, pass it on when the time comes. Make it a legacy instead of a memorial. They left Arlington as the sun set, painting the white stones gold and red. Behind them, Ruth's grave stood among thousands of others, finally acknowledged but still just one stone among many. The fight wasn't over, wasn't close to over. 53 other cases to investigate, cultures to change, assumptions to challenge. But the first step had been taken. The silence had broken. The distance between erasure and acknowledgement had collapsed. And somewhere Elle hoped, Ruth knew that her silence hadn't been for nothing, that her documentation had mattered, that her granddaughter had taken the shots she'd taught and used them to fight the battles she couldn't. The distance between who they see and who you are wasn't measured in yards anymore. It was measured in generations. From Ruth to Elle to whoever came next. From silence to speech. From erasure to acknowledgement. From acceptance to resistance. And the distance was closing. One shot at a time. One truth at a time. One acknowledgement at a time. Until the day when excellence was recognized regardless of who achieved it. Until the day when documentation wasn't necessary because erasure wasn't possible. That day wasn't here yet, but it was closer than it had been 68 years ago. Closer than it had been when Ruth made her first shot in frozen Korea. Closer than it had been when Elle pulled the trigger in Afghan mountains. The distance was collapsing, slowly, inevitably, with the patience Ruth had taught and the resistance Elle had learned. And 68 years of silence had finally found its voice. The call came 18 months after Arlington. Elle was at Fort Moore, Georgia, running the advanced marksmanship program that now bore her grandmother's name. 60 students in the current class, 19 of them women, all of them learning techniques Ruth had developed in frozen mountains 69 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The Army was now teaching what it had once tried to erase. The number on Elle's phone was civilian, unknown. She answered anyway, already calculating what crisis might need her attention. Sergeant First Class Garrison, this is Amanda Tors. I'm a researcher with the Army Historical Division. We've been processing records from the Korean War Review. I found something I think you need to see. Elle stepped outside the classroom, letting her assistant instructor take over the wind-reading lecture. What kind of something? A classified operation report from May 1952. It mentions your grandmother, but there's a detail that doesn't match any of the documentation Cross provided. A mission after the Chosin operations, something we didn't know about. The world tilted slightly. Elle had thought they'd found everything. Cross had been meticulous. The review had been comprehensive. What could possibly be left? Can you send me the file? It's still classified, but I can tell you what it says, and I think you're going to want to sit down for this. Elle sat on the bench outside the range building, watched her students through the window, young faces focused and serious, learning to collapse distance the way Ruth had taught, the way Elle now taught, the legacy continuing in the only way that mattered. Go ahead, she said. Tors took a breath. May 15, 1952, 3 weeks after the last documented Chosin operation. Your grandmother and Corporal Cross were assigned to an operation that officially never happened. Rescue of a CIA asset from behind enemy lines. The asset was a double agent, North Korean intelligence officer providing information to American forces. His cover was blown. He had maybe 6 hours before execution. Ruth rescued him. She did more than that. The asset was being held in a fortified position near the Yalu River, 20 guards, Chinese regulars, no approach vector that wouldn't result in casualties. Command was ready to abandon the extraction, write off the asset as a loss. Your grandmother proposed an alternative. Elle felt her chest tighten. What kind of alternative? She would eliminate the guards, all 20 of them, from a single position. Give the extraction team a window to get in and out. Command thought it was impossible. 20 targets, moving patterns, overlapping fields of fire. Even if she could make the shots, the first kill would alert the others. They'd scatter, find cover, game over. But she didn't make the first shot. Tor's voice carried something like awe. She made all 20 shots in 97 seconds, worked a pattern, started with perimeter guards during shift change, moved inward as confusion spread, timed it so each guard dropped when others weren't looking. By the time anyone realized they were under attack, there was no one left alive to mount defense. The extraction team walked in, pulled the asset, walked out. 0 casualties. The scope of it was staggering. 20 kills, 97 seconds, the kind of shooting that shouldn't be possible. That would sound like fiction if it wasn't documented by people who'd witnessed it. The asset, Elle said slowly. Did he survive? Did the intelligence he provided matter? He provided locations of 3 major Chinese weapons depots and troop staging areas. Information that prevented a spring offensive that would have cost hundreds of American lives. He was exfiltrated to the United States, given new identity, lived under protection for the next 50 years. Torres paused. He died in 2003. Virginia. Heart attack. But before he died, he recorded a testimony. Said he owed his life to a woman whose name he never knew. Called her the ghost who made 20 men disappear. Elle felt something break loose in her chest. Not grief exactly. Something else. Validation delayed so long it had calcified into permanent ache. Why was this classified? Why wasn't it in the review? Because the operation technically violated Geneva Convention protocols regarding assassination versus combat engagement. Command classified it to avoid war crimes investigation. Your grandmother's role was buried not just because she was a woman, but because acknowledging the operation would have required explaining why 20 enemy combatants died in 97 seconds with no warning, no chance to surrender. The bitter mathematics of war. Ruth had saved American lives, had prevented an offensive that would have killed hundreds, but doing it required killing in a way that made politicians nervous. So they'd buried her achievement to protect themselves from questions they didn't want to answer. Is there footage, documentation? Cross's after-action report. No footage, but there are witness statements from the extraction team. All of them say the same thing. They've never seen shooting like it, never seen anyone move through targets with that kind of precision and speed. One of them wrote that watching your grandmother work was like watching physics bend to will. Elle thought about the journal, 40 entries, but shot number 40 was dated March 1952. What came after wasn't documented. Ruth had stopped writing, had drawn the line between what she'd record and what she'd take to the grave. Ms. Torres, what happens to this information now? That's why I'm calling. The Historical Review Board needs to decide whether to declassify, whether the value of acknowledging your grandmother's service outweighs the political complications of revealing the operation. They're asking for family input, whether you want this to become part of the official record. Elle looked through the window at her students, saw a young woman, maybe 23, carefully adjusting her scope while an instructor watched. The same age Ruth had been when she'd made those 20 shots, the same focus, the same determination to master skill that didn't care about politics or gender or bureaucratic convenience. Declassify it, Elle said. All of it, the operation, the kills, the context. Ruth spent her whole life having her achievements buried to protect institutions that didn't protect her. I'm not doing that anymore. The truth matters more than comfort. Even if it's complicated, even if it makes some people uncomfortable with the methods. Especially then, war is complicated. Combat is uncomfortable. Pretending otherwise dishonors everyone who's ever had to make impossible choices in impossible situations. Ruth made those shots to save lives. That's what matters. Everything else is just politics. Torres was quiet for a moment. There's one more thing, the CIA asset. Before he died, he established a trust, significant amount of money. Instructions were that it should go to the family of the woman who saved him if she could ever be identified. With your grandmother's record corrected, we can finally execute those instructions. The money comes to you. Elle almost laughed. He left money to someone whose name he didn't know. He left it to the ghost who made 20 men disappear. Said if America ever acknowledged what she did, The family deserved compensation for the years of silence they endured. Tor's voice softened. It's substantial, Sergeant. Enough to change your life if you want it to. Elle thought about Ruth, about living 68 years with skills unacknowledged, about dying without recognition, about the weight of carrying excellence nobody wanted to see. What did he specify the money should be used for? Training the next generation. His exact words were, so her knowledge doesn't die with her. The irony completed itself. Ruth's skills were already being taught. The program bearing her name was already training snipers, but money meant expansion, resources, the ability to reach more students, to formalize what had been improvised, to turn legacy into institution. Use it for the program, Elle said. The Ruth Garrison Advanced Marksmanship Program. Expand it, make it permanent. Endow it so even when I'm gone, even when Cross is gone, even when everyone who remembers Ruth directly is dead, the training continues. Her knowledge becomes doctrine. Her techniques become standard. So she's not just remembered, she's implemented. Tors agreed to draft the documents. The call ended. Elle sat on the bench watching her students and thought about the distance between then and now. Ruth's 20 kills in 97 seconds. The CIA asset whose life depended on shooting that shouldn't be possible. The testimony recorded decades later by a man who never knew his savior's name but knew his debt. Cross called that evening. He'd been contacted by the Historical Review Board, had provided additional context about the May 1952 operation, had confirmed details Tors had mentioned. His voice carried the weight of memory refreshed, of watching history rewritten in real time. I was there, he said without preamble. I spotted for her 20 targets. I called them out. She made the shots. I've never told anyone because it was classified, because talking about it would mean court-martial, because silence was the price of walking away from that war. Cross, why didn't Ruth document it? She wrote about everything else. Why not this one? The silence stretched. When Cross spoke again, his voice was different, older, more fragile, because it broke something in her. 20 men in 97 seconds. She did it because it needed doing, because lives depended on it, because she was the only one who could. But after, she was different, quieter. She stopped writing in the journal, stopped talking about the shots, just did the work and existed in the spaces between. PTSD. They didn't call it that. Called it combat fatigue or adjustment issues or just weakness. But yes, killing 20 men, even enemy combatants, even in legitimate combat, that leaves marks. Cross's voice cracked. Your grandmother carried those marks for 68 years, and the army that asked her to make those shots then denied she'd ever made them. Denied her the support she needed because acknowledging her trauma would mean acknowledging her service. Elle felt rage building, clean, pure, the kind that came from understanding injustice so complete it stopped being abstract and became personal. They broke her and then erased her. Yes, and she let them because she thought silence would protect her family, would let her move on, build a life. Cross took a breath. But I think the silence broke her as much as the killing did, not being able to talk about it, not being able to process it, carrying it alone for 68 years because the institution that used her refused to acknowledge it had used her. They talked for another hour, Cross filling in details about the May 1952 operation, the pressure, the impossibility, the way Ruth had approached it like mathematics, breaking down 20 targets into sequences, patterns, rhythms. The way her breathing had stayed steady even as the body count climbed. The way she'd cleared her rifle afterward and said nothing, just packed her gear and waited for extraction like it was routine. She never talked about it again, Cross said finally. Not to me, not to anyone as far as I know, just carried it alone for 68 years. That's the weight I think about now. Not the shots, the silence after, The burden of excellence nobody acknowledged and trauma nobody validated. 6 months later, Elle stood in a different ceremony. Not Arlington this time. Fort Moore. The ribbon cutting for the Ruth Garrison Center for Advanced Marksmanship. Permanent facility. Dedicated staff. Curriculum based on techniques Ruth had developed in Korean winter and Elle had refined in Afghan mountains. Resources funded by the trust from a man whose name was still classified but whose gratitude had outlived him by 2 decades. The building was state-of-the-art, climate-controlled ranges, ballistic computers, training aids. Everything Ruth had improvised in frozen mud now formalized in concrete and steel. The irony was profound. The Army was now investing millions in teaching what they'd once classified to hide. Senator McAllister spoke at the ceremony. Older now, frailer, but still carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades in power and knew how to wield it. Some of you served in Korea. Some of you know what Chosin winter meant. -30 temperatures, fingers freezing to metal, rifles jamming, men dying from cold before combat ever touched them. He paused, letting that sink in. And in those conditions, Sergeant Major Ruth Garrison made shots that seasoned snipers today, with modern equipment and climate-controlled ranges, struggle to replicate. She did it with frozen hands, obsolete equipment, and zero recognition. We owe her more than a building. We owe her the truth. He looked at Elle, at the students, at the building that would carry Ruth's name into a future she'd never see. This center isn't just about teaching marksmanship. It's about making sure we never again erase competence because it makes us uncomfortable. Never again silence excellence because it doesn't fit our narrative. Never again lose decades of knowledge because we're too invested in being right to learn from being wrong. The ribbon was cut. The building opened. Elle walked through spaces designed for teaching what Ruth had known instinctively. Thought about her grandmother navigating Korean winter without the resources now available to students who'd never faced combat. The distance between then and now measured in technology and doctrine and institutional acknowledgement that came too late for Ruth but might arrive in time for others. That evening, Elle sat in her office at the new center. The journal was on her desk. Ruth's 40 entries plus Elle's 41 shots that had changed everything by refusing to stay silent. She opened to a blank page, picked up a pen. What do you write after the victory, after the recognition, after the system that erased your grandmother finally admits it was wrong? She thought about the students in her classes, about the women who'd told her they joined the military because they'd seen footage of her shot, because they'd read about Ruth, because they wanted to be part of something that acknowledged skill over stereotype. She thought about Brennan, broken by his own consistency, destroyed by 68 years of defending a lie he'd started believing, about the 53 other women whose records were being corrected, about the culture slowly shifting, painfully, incrementally, toward something that might eventually be fair. She thought about Cross, 89 now, still teaching occasionally, still carrying guilt that acknowledgement couldn't erase, still trying to pay a debt that could never be fully satisfied because Ruth wasn't alive to receive payment. And she thought about the future, about the next generation who'd learn Ruth's techniques without knowing the cost of their development, about the distance between original innovation and standardized doctrine, about legacy measured in what gets taught long after the teacher is forgotten. She wrote, Shot number 42, not a kill, a student, Private Jennifer Santos, 22 years old, from Texas like Ruth, struggling with mirage reading. I showed her Ruth's technique, the one developed in Korean winter where mirage patterns were complicated by frozen air layers. Watch the shimmer, find the rhythm. Trust the pattern even when conditions say it's impossible. Santos made a 1,000-meter shot, first try, variable wind. Afterward, she asked who taught me. I told her about Ruth. About 60 confirmed kills in conditions that would kill most snipers, about silence that lasted 68 years, about the price of excellence in a system designed to diminish it. Santos cried, said her great-grandmother had been a nurse in Korea, never talked about it, never got recognition, just carried the weight and died quiet. I told her the silence is breaking, slowly but breaking. Santos is going to be good, maybe better than good. And this time we'll document it, we'll acknowledge it, we'll make sure her excellence doesn't get erased. From Chosin to Afghanistan to wherever comes next, the shots continue, the legacy grows. She set down the pen. The entry sat there linking past to future, Ruth's 40 to Elle's 1 to Santos's future shots. The journal wasn't finished. Wouldn't be finished as long as there were students to teach, skills to pass on, excellence to acknowledge. Cross appeared at her door. He'd aged visibly in the last 18 months. The weight of 90 years plus 68 years of guilt showing in the way he moved. But his eyes were clear. Purpose did that. Gave you reason to keep moving even when the body protested. You wrote in the journal, he said. It wasn't a question. He could read her the way spotters learn to read shooters. Shot number 42, a student. Ruth would like that, the journal continuing with teaching instead of killing. He sat down slowly. I've been thinking about legacy, about what we leave behind. I kept Ruth's records for 68 years thinking someday they'd matter. Someday someone would ask the right questions. I was right, but I was also wrong. How so? The records mattered because they proved what happened, but they didn't prevent it from happening to others. Documentation without reform is just evidence of pattern. We've proven the injustice. Now comes the harder part, making sure it doesn't repeat. Elle understood what he wasn't saying. The center was progress. The program was implementation. But institutions had inertia. Culture had momentum. Real change required sustained pressure over decades, not ceremonies and ribbon cuttings. Cross, you're 89. You've been fighting this fight for 68 years. At some point, you're allowed to rest. I'll rest when I'm dead. Until then, I've got debt to pay. He looked at the journal. Ruth asked me once in 1975 if she'd been wrong to stay silent. I told her she did what she thought was best, but the real answer was yes. She was wrong, and I was wrong for enabling it. Silence doesn't protect, it just delays the reckoning. So we keep fighting. We keep teaching. Fighting is reactive. Teaching is proactive. Every student who learns Ruth's techniques, who hears her story, who understands the cost of erasure, that's prevention. That's cultural change. They sat in comfortable silence. Outside, the range was active. Distant shots echoing across the facility. Students learning to collapse distance between intention and impact, between threat and safety, between who they were and who they could become. The phone rang. Elle answered, Tours again, voice carrying excitement barely controlled. Sergeant, the Historical Review Board just released their findings. They're recommending Ruth for the Medal of Honor, not just for Chosin, for the complete body of work. 60 confirmed kills, 20 in the May operation, dozens of lives saved. They're calling it the most comprehensive combat record of any sniper in the Korean War. Elle felt her throat tighten. When? Ceremony is being scheduled for next spring. White House. President will present. They want you there. They want it to be big, public. Acknowledgement that can't be walked back or minimized. Medal of Honor. The recognition McAllister had tried to secure in 1952. The recommendation that had been buried. The acknowledgement Ruth had been denied for 68 years and wouldn't live to receive. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like closing a wound that had scarred over wrong. The ceremony happened on a spring day that would have pleased Ruth. Clear sky, Light wind. The kind of day where shooting was more pleasure than work. Elle stood in the White House in dress uniform, surrounded by military brass and politicians and media documenting everything for posterity that should have been documented in 1954. The president spoke about sacrifice and service and breaking barriers, about Ruth's 60 kills and the 20-shot operation, and the lives saved through excellence that demanded acknowledgement regardless of gender. The speech was good, well written, hitting the right notes about progress and justice and institutional learning. But Elle kept thinking about Ruth, about the woman who'd written 40 entries in a journal nobody read, who'd made shots nobody acknowledged, who'd carried skills she couldn't teach and trauma she couldn't share, who died without recognition thinking maybe she'd been wrong to stay silent. The Medal of Honor was presented to Elle on Ruth's behalf. The citation was comprehensive, detailed, acknowledging every operation, every shot, every life saved, the recognition complete, the record corrected, the silence broken after 68 years. Elle accepted it thinking about distance, the 60 yards Ruth could shoot, the 2,147 meters Elle had shot, the 68 years between Ruth's service and Ruth's recognition, the generations between silence and speech, the gap between what happened and what gets acknowledged. All distances that could be measured, but the distance that mattered most couldn't be quantified. It was the space between who Ruth had been and who she'd been allowed to be, between her excellence and the institution's comfort, between her knowledge and its implementation, between her life and her legacy. That distance had finally collapsed, but the collapse came too late for Ruth to feel it, too late for her to stand here and receive what she'd earned, too late for anything except making sure the next woman didn't wait 68 years for acknowledgement. After the ceremony, Elle visited Arlington. Ruth's grave now had additional honors: Medal of Honor recipient, Sergeant Major, Silver Star. The stone updated to reflect what should have been acknowledged in 1954. The distance between death and recognition measured in decades but finally closed. Elle placed the Medal of Honor on the grave, sat beside it the way she'd sat 18 months ago when the Silver Star was presented. Cross was beside her again, older, frailer, but present, always present for Ruth. "Do you think she knows?" Elle asked. "Wherever she is, does she know we finally got it right?" Cross was quiet. Then, "I think she knew it would happen eventually. That's why she kept the journal, why she documented everything even when documentation was dangerous. She was patient, understood that truth deferred isn't truth denied, that silence is temporary but excellence is permanent." "I wish she was here." "She is, in the techniques we teach, in the students we train, in the program bearing her name, in your shot that proved her legacy wasn't myth." Cross put his hand on the stone. "This is closure, Elle, not for Ruth, for us, for those of us who failed her by staying silent, who enabled erasure by accepting it, who survived her long enough to see the record corrected but not long enough to undo the damage." Elle understood. The Medal of Honor wasn't for Ruth. Ruth was beyond needing recognition. The medal was for the living, for the institution admitting error, for the witnesses acknowledging complicity, for the next generation seeing that eventually truth emerged. They sat until the sun set, until the stone turned golden, then gray, then disappeared into darkness, until the weight of decades settled into something that might, eventually, be peace. Elle stood, picked up the Medal of Honor. It would go in the center, on display, proof that excellence couldn't be permanently erased, that silence was temporary, that the distance between who you were and who they acknowledged always collapsed eventually, even if eventually came too late for comfort. She walked away from the grave thinking about tomorrow, about students waiting to learn, about techniques to teach, about the journal with space for more entries, about the distance between Ruth's 40 shots and whatever number would eventually be written last. The shots would continue, the legacy would grow, the distance would collapse, not all at once, not clean and complete, but incrementally, inexorably, with the patience of someone who understood that change operated on geological timescales and you measured progress in generations, not years. Ruth had planted seeds in silence, had documented in darkness, had carried knowledge nobody acknowledged and skills nobody learned from. For 68 years, those seeds lay dormant. Then Elle had made her shot, had broken the silence, had created conditions where Ruth's knowledge could germinate. Now the growth was visible, students learning, program expanding, culture shifting. The distance between then and now collapsing one technique, one student, one acknowledgement at a time. It would take decades, maybe generations, but the trajectory was set, the pattern was broken, the silence was finished. And somewhere Elle hoped, Ruth knew her silence hadn't been for nothing, knew her documentation had mattered, knew her granddaughter had taken the legacy and turned it into institution, had taken 40 shots nobody acknowledged and made them the foundation of training that would shape thousands. Elle returned to Fort Moore, to the center bearing Ruth's name, to the students learning Ruth's techniques, to the office where the journal waited for the next entry. She opened to a blank page, picked up a pen, and wrote. The distance between who they see and who you are isn't fixed. It's not permanent. It changes when you refuse to accept it, when you document instead of staying silent, when you fight instead of surrendering. Ruth taught me to shoot, but she also taught me to measure distance. Not in yards, in years, in generations, in the gap between excellence and acknowledgement. That gap is closing because she documented, because I fought, because students are learning, because the silence broke. The distance isn't zero yet, but it's closing, one shot at a time, one student at a time, one acknowledgement at a time, until who they see and who you are become the same thing, until the distance disappears, until all that remains is the work, the shot, the truth. That's the final distance, the one that matters most, and we're closing it together across time, across generations, from silence to speech, from erasure to legacy, from 40 shots to infinity. The distance collapses. The work continues, the legacy lives. She set down the pen, the entry complete, the journal waiting for whoever came next, the distance measured, the work defined, the legacy secured. Outside, the shots continued. Students learning to collapse distance between intention and impact, between threat and safety, between who they were and who they could become. The distance between Ruth and recognition had been 68 years, but the distance between Ruth and legacy was zero. Because excellence, once documented, couldn't be permanently erased. Because silence, once broken, couldn't be reimposed. Because the distance, once collapsed, stayed collapsed. And the shots, once taken, echoed forever. The hardest part of researching this story wasn't finding the records. Master Sergeant Cross kept them for 68 years. It was realizing how many other Ruth Garrisons are still out there, still classified, still forgotten. If you served or your father served in Korea, you might know her story without knowing her name. The ghost sniper at Chosin, the shots that saved your unit, the records that mysteriously disappeared. Did your family ever mention a woman who saved them in Korea, or a shot that shouldn't have been possible? Drop a comment. These stories need to be told. And if you believe service should be honored regardless of who serves, hit that subscribe button. We've got 47 more untold stories coming this year. What should we uncover next? Bill.